Production growth and income growth must not get out of step in my empire. That is the substance of my command. There are to be no balance of payment difficulties between the different spheres of influence, and the reason for this is simply because I command it. I want to emphasize my authority in this area. I am the supreme energy eater of this domain, and will remain so, alive or dead. My government is the economy. Order and Council, the Emperor Paul Muad'Dib. I will leave you here, the old man said, taking his hand from Paul's sleeve. It is on the right, second door from the far end. Go with Shai Hulud, Muad'Dib, and remember when you were Yusul. Paul's guide slipped away into the darkness. There would be security men somewhere out there waiting to grab the guide and take the man to a place of questioning. Paul knew, but Paul found himself hoping the old Fremen would escape. There were stars overhead and the distant light of the first moon, somewhere beyond the shield wall, but this place was not the open desert where a man could sight on a star to guide his course. The old man had brought him into one of the new suburbs. This much Paul recognized. This street was now thick with sand blown in from encroaching dunes. A dim light glowed from a single public dispenser globe far down the street. It gave enough illumination to show that this was a dead-end street. The air around him was thick with the smell of a reclamation still. The thing must be poorly capped for its fetid odours to escape, losing a dangerously wasteful amount of moisture into the night air. How careless these people had grown, Paul thought. They were millionaires of water, forgetful of the days when a man on Arrakis would have been killed for just an eighth share of the water in his body. Why am I hesitating? Paul wondered. It is the second door from the far end. I knew that without being told. But this thing must be played out with precision, so I hesitate. The noise of an argument arose suddenly from the corner of the house on Paul's left. A woman there berated someone. The new wing of their house leaked dust, she complained. Did he think water fell from heaven? If dust came in, moisture got out. Some remember, Paul thought. He moved down the street and the quarrel faded away behind. Water from heaven, he thought. Some Fremen had seen that wonder on other worlds. He had seen it himself, had ordered it for Arrakis, but the memory of it felt like something that had occurred to another person. Rain, it was called. Abruptly he recalled a rainstorm on his birth world. Clouds thick and grey in the sky of Caladan, an electric storm presence, moist air, and the big wet drops drumming on skylights. It ran in rivulets off the eaves. Storm drains took the water away to a river which ran muddy and turgid past the family orchards, trees there with their barren branches glistening wetly. Paul's foot caught in a low drift of sand across the street. For an instant he felt mud clinging to the shoes of his childhood. Then he was back in the sand, in the dust-clotted, wind-muffled darkness of the future hanging over him, taunting. He could feel the aridity of life around him like an accusation. Who did this? They had become a civilization of dry-eyed watchers and tale-tellers, people who solved all problems of power, and still more power, hating every erg of it. Rough stones came underfoot. His vision remembered them. The dark rectangle of a doorway appeared on his right, black in black. Ovaim's house, Fate's house, a place different from the ones around it only in the roll time had chosen for it. It was a strange place to be marked down in history. The door opened to his knock. The gap revealed the dull green light of an atrium. A dwarf peered out, ancient face on a child's body, an apparition a prescience had never seen. You've come then, the apparition said. The dwarf stepped aside, no awe in his manner, merely the gloating of a slow smile. Come in, come in. Paul hesitated. There'd been no dwarf in the vision, but all else remained identical. Visions could contain such disparities and still hold true to their original plunge into infinity. But the difference dared him to hope. He glanced back up the street at the creamy pearl glistening of his moon swimming out of jagged shadows. The moon haunted him. How did it fall? Come in, the dwarf insisted. Paul entered, heard the door thud into its moisture seals behind. The dwarf passed him, led the way, enormous feet slapping the floor, opened the delicate lattice gate into the roofed central courtyard, gestured. They await, sire. Sire, Paul thought. He knows me then. Before Paul could explore this discovery, the dwarf slipped away down a side passage. Hope was a dervish wind whirling, dancing in Paul. He headed across the courtyard. It was a dark and gloomy place, the smell of sickness and defeat in it. He felt daunted by the atmosphere. Was it defeat to choose a lesser evil? He wondered. How far down this track had he come? Light poured from a narrow doorway in the far wall. He put down the feeling of watchers and evil smells, entered the doorway into a small room. It was a barren place by Fremen standards, with hair-egg hangings on only 2 walls. Opposite the door, a man sat on carmine cushions beneath the best hanging. A feminine figure hovered in shadows behind another doorway in a barren wall to the left. Paul felt vision trapped. This was the way it had gone. Where was the dwarf? Where was the difference? His scenes absorbed the room in a single gestalt and sweep. The place had received painstaking care despite its poor furnishings. Hooks and rods across the barren walls showed where hangings had been removed. Pilgrims paid enormous prices for authentic Fremen artifacts, Paul reminded himself. Rich pilgrims counted desert tapestries as treasures, true marks of a Hajj. Paul felt for the barren walls accused him with their fresh gypsum wash. The threadbare condition of the two remaining hangings amplified the sense of guilt. A narrow shelf occupied the wall on his right. It held a row of portraits, mostly bearded Fremen, some in stillsuits with their catch tubes dangling, some in imperial uniforms posed against exotic off-world backgrounds. The most common scene was a seascape. The Fremen on the cushions cleared his throat, forcing Paul to look at him. It was Ovaim precisely as the vision had revealed him. Neck grown scrawny, a bird thing which appeared too weak to support the large head. The face was a lopsided ruin, networks of crisscrossed scars on the left cheek below a drooping, wet eye, but clear skin on the other side, and a straight, blue and blue Fremen gaze. A long kedge of a nose bisected the face. Ovaim's cushion sat in the corner of a threadbare rug, brown with maroon and gold threads. The cushion fabric betrayed splotches of wear and patching, but every bit of metal around the seated figure shone from polishing. The portrait frames, shelf lip and brackets, the pedestal of a low table on the right. Paul nodded to the clear half of Ovaim's face, said, "Good luck to you in your dwelling place." It was the greeting of an old friend and siege mate. "So I see you once more, Yusul." The voice speaking his tribal name whined with an old man's quavering. The dull, drooping eye on the ruined side of the face moved above the parchment skin and scars. Grey bristles stubbed that side, and the jawline there hung with scabrous peelings. Ovaim's mouth twisted as he spoke, the gap exposing silvery metal teeth. "Muad'Dib always answers the call of a Fedaykin," Paul said. The woman in the doorway shadows moved, said, "So Stilgar boasts." She came forward into the light, an older version of the Lichna which the face dancer had copied. Paul recalled then that Ovaim had married sisters. Her hair was grey, nose grown witch-sharp. Weaver's calluses ran along her forefingers and thumbs. A Fremen woman would have displayed such marks proudly in the siege days, but she saw his attention on her hands, hid them under a fold of her pale blue robe. Paul remembered her name then, Duri. The shock was he remembered her as a child, not as she'd been in his vision of these moments. It was the wine that edged her voice, Paul told himself. She'd whined even as a child. "You see me here," Paul said. "Would I be here if Stilgar hadn't approved?" He turned toward Ovaim. "I carry your water burden, Ovaim. Command me." This was the straight Fremen talk of siege brothers. Ovaim produced a shaky nod, almost too much for that thin neck. He lifted a liver-marked left hand, pointed to the ruin of his face. "I caught the splitting disease on Tarahel, Yusul," he wheezed, "right after the victory when we'd all—" A fit of coughing stopped his voice. "The tribe will collect his water soon," Juri said. She crossed to Ovaim, propped pillows behind him, held his shoulder to steady him until the coughing passed. She wasn't really very old, Paul saw, but a look of lost hopes ringed her mouth. Bitterness lay in her eyes. "I'll summon doctors," Paul said. Juri turned, hand on hip. "We've had medical men, as good as any you could summon." She sent an involuntary glance to the barren wall on her left, and the medical men were costly, Paul thought. He felt edgy, constrained by the vision but aware that minor differences had crept in. How could he exploit the differences? Time came out of its skein with subtle changes, but the background fabric held oppressive sameness. He knew with terrifying certainty that if he tried to break out of the enclosing pattern here, it'd become a thing of terrible violence. The power in this deceptively gentle flow of time oppressed him. "Say what you want of me," he growled. "Couldn't it be that Ovaim needed a friend to stand by him in this time?" Juri asked. "Does a Fedaykin have to consign his flesh to strangers?" "We shared siege, Tabor," Paul reminded himself. "She has the right to berate me for apparent callousness." "What I can do, I will do," Paul said. Another fit of coughing shook Ovaim. When it had passed, he gasped. "There's treachery, Yusul. Fremen plot against you." His mouth worked then without sound. Spittle escaped his lips. Juri wiped his mouth with a corner of her robe, and Paul saw how her face betrayed anger at such waste of moisture. Frustrated rage threatened to overwhelm Paul then. That Ovaim should be spent thus. A Fedaykin deserved better. But no choice remained. Not for a deaf commander or his emperor. They walked Occam's razor in this room. The slightest misstep multiplied horrors, not just for themselves but for all humankind, even for those who would destroy them. Paul squeezed calmness into his mind, looked at Duri. The expression of terrible longing with which she gazed at Ovaim strengthened Paul. "Chani must never look at me that way," he told himself. Lichna spoke of a message, Paul said. "My dwarf," Ovaim wheezed. "I brought him on a world. I forget. He's a human distrans, a Troy discarded by the Tleilaxu. He's recorded all the names, the traitors. Ovaim fell silent, trembling. You speak of Lickna, Duria said. When you arrived, we knew she'd reached you safely. If you're thinking of this new burden Ovaim places upon you, Lickna is the sum of that burden. An even exchange, Usul. Take the dwarf and go. Paul suppressed a shudder, closed his eyes. Lickna. The real daughter had perished in the desert, a Samita-racked body abandoned to the sand and the wind. Opening his eyes, Paul said, You could have come to me at any time for. Ovaim stayed away that he might be numbered among those who hate you, Usul, Duri said. The house to the south of us at the end of the street, that is a gathering place for your foes. It's why we took this hovel. Then summon the dwarf and we'll leave, Paul said. You've not listened well, Duri said. You must take the dwarf to a safe place, Ovaim said, an odd strength in his voice. He carries the only record of the traitors. No one suspects his talent. They think I keep him for amusement. We cannot leave, Duri said. Only you and the dwarf. It's known how poor we are. We've said we're selling the dwarf. They'll take you for the buyer. It's your only chance. Paul consulted his memory of the vision. In it, he'd left here with names of the traitors, but never seeing how those names were carried. The dwarf obviously moved under the protection of another oracle. It occurred to Paul then that all creatures must carry some kind of destiny stamped out, by purposes of varying strengths, by the fixation of training and disposition. From the moment the jihad had chosen him, he'd felt himself hemmed in by the forces of a multitude. Their fixed purposes demanded and controlled his course. Any delusions of free will he harbored now must be merely the prisoner rattling his cage. His curse lay in the fact that he saw the cage. He saw it? He listened now to the emptiness of this house, only the four of them in it, Duri, Ovaim, the dwarf, and himself. He inhaled the fear and tension of his companions, sensed the watchers, his own force hovering in Fopters far overhead, and those others, next door. I was wrong to hope, Paul thought, but thinking of hope brought him a twisted sense of hope, and he felt that he might yet seize his moment. Summon the dwarf, he said. Bijaz, Duri called. You call me? The dwarf stepped into the room from the courtyard, an alert expression of worry on his face. You have a new master, Bijaz, Duri said. She stared at Paul. You may call him Usul. Usul, that's the base of the pillar, Bijaz said, translating. How can Usul be base when I'm the basest thing living? He always speaks thus, Ovaim apologized. I don't speak, Bijaz said. I operate a machine called language. It creaks and groans, but is mine own. A Tleilaxu toy, learned and alert, Paul thought. The B'nai Tleilax never threw away something this valuable. He turned, studied the dwarf. Round Malange eyes returned his stare. What other talents have you, Bijaz? Paul asked. I know when we should leave, Bijaz said. It's a talent few men have. There's a time for endings. That's a good beginning. Let us begin to go, Usul. Paul examined his vision memory. No dwarf, but the little man's words fitted the occasion. At the door, you called me sire, Paul said. You know me, then? You've sired, sire, Bijaz said, grinning. You are much more than the base Usul. You're the Atreides Emperor, Paul Muad'Dib, and you are my finger. He held up the index finger of his right hand. Bijaz, Duri snapped. You tempt fate. I tempt my finger, Bijaz protested, voice squeaking. He pointed at Usul. I point at Usul. Is my finger not Usul himself, or is it a reflection of something more base? He brought the finger close to his eyes, examined it with a mocking grin, first one side then the other. Ah, it's merely a finger after all. He often rattles on thus, Duri said, worry in her voice. I think it's why he was discarded by the Tleilaxu. I'll not be patronized, Bijaz said. Yes, yet I have a new patron. How strange the workings of the finger. He peered at Duri and Ovaim, eyes oddly bright. A weak glue bound us, Ovaim. A few tears and we part. The dwarf's big feet rasped on the floor as he whirled completely around, stopped facing Paul. Ah, patron. I came the long way around to find you. Paul nodded. You'll be kind, Usul? Bijaz asked. I'm a person, you know. Persons come in many shapes and sizes. This be but one of them. I'm weak of muscle, but strong of mouth. Cheap to feed, but costly to fill. Empty me as you will, there's still more in me than men put there. We've no time for your stupid riddles, Duri growled. You should be gone. I'm riddled with conundrums, Bijaz said, but not all of them stupid. To be gone, Usul, is to be a bygone. Yes? Let us let bygones be bygones. Duri speaks truth, and I've the talent for bearing that too. You've truth sense? Paul asked, determined now to wait out the clockwork of his vision. Anything was better than shattering these moments and producing the new consequences. There remained things for Ovaim to say, lest time be diverted into even more horrifying channels. I have now sense, Bijaz said. Paul noted that the dwarf had grown more nervous. Was the little man aware of things about to happen? Could Bijaz be his own oracle? Did you inquire of Licknar? Ovaim asked suddenly, peering up at Dury with his one good eye. Licknar is safe, Dury said. Paul lowered his head, lest his expression betray the lie. Safe. Licknar was ashes in a secret grave. That's good then, Ovaim said, taking Paul's lowered head for a nod of agreement. One good thing among the evils, you saw. I don't like the world we're making, you know that? It was better when we were alone in the desert with only the Harkonnens for enemy. There's but a thin line between many an enemy and many a friend, Bijaz said. Where that line stops, there's no beginning and no end. Let's end it, my friends. He moved to Paul's side, jittered from one foot to the other. What's now, sense? Paul asked, dragging out these moments, goading the dwarf. Now, Bijaz said, trembling. Now, now. He tugged at Paul's robe. Let us go now. His mouth rattles, but there's no harm in him, Ovaim said, affection in his voice, the one good eye staring at Bijaz. Even a rattle can signal departure, Bijaz said, and so can tears. Let's be gone while there's time to begin. Bijaz, what do you fear? Paul asked. I fear the spirit seeking me now, Bijaz muttered. Perspiration stood out on his forehead. His cheeks twitched. I fear the one who thinks not and will have no body except mine, and that one gone back into itself. I fear the things I see and the things I do not see. This dwarf does possess the power of prescience, Paul thought. Bijaz shared the terrifying oracle. Did he share the oracle's fate as well? How potent was the dwarf's power? Did he have the little prescience of those who dabbled in the Dune tarot? Or was it something greater? How much had he seen? Best you go, Dury said. Bijaz is right. Every minute we linger, Bijaz said, prolongs the present. Every minute I linger defers my guilt, Paul thought. A worm's poisonous breath, its teeth dripping dust, had washed over him. It had happened long ago, but he inhaled the memory of it now, spice and bitterness. He could sense his own worm waiting, the urn of the desert. These are troubled times, he said, addressing himself to Ovaim's judgment of their world. Fremen know what to do in time of trouble, Dury said. Ovaim contributed a shaky nod. Paul glanced at Dury. He'd not expected gratitude, would have been burdened by it more than he could bear, but Ovaim's bitterness and the passionate resentment he saw in Dury's eyes shook his resolve. Was anything worth this price? Delay serves no purpose, Dury said. Do what you must, Yusul, Ovaim wheezed. Paul sighed. The words of the vision had been spoken. There'll be an accounting, he said to complete it. Turning, he strode from the room, heard Bijaz's foot slapping behind. Bygones, Bijaz muttered as they went. Let bygones fall where they may. This has been a dirty day. The convoluted wording of legalisms grew up around the necessity to hide from ourselves the violence we intend toward each other. Between depriving a man of 1 hour from his life and depriving him of his life, there exists only a difference of degree. You have done violence to him, consumed his energy. Elaborate euphemisms may conceal your intent to kill, but behind any use of power over another, the ultimate assumption remains, I feed on your energy. Addenda to orders in council, the Emperor Paul Muad'Dib. First moon stood high over the city as Paul, his shield activated and shimmering around him, emerged from the cul-de-sac. A wind off the massif whirled sand and dust down the narrow street, causing Bijaz to blink and shield his eyes. You must hurry, the dwarf muttered. Hurry, hurry. You sense danger? Paul asked, probing. I know danger. An abrupt sense of peril very near was followed almost immediately by a figure joining them out of a doorway. Bijaz crouched and whimpered. It was only Stilgar, moving like a war machine, head thrust forward, feet striking the street solidly. Swiftly, Paul explained the value of the dwarf, handed Bijaz over to Stilgar. The pace of the vision moved here with great rapidity. Stilgar sped away with Bijaz. Security guards enveloped Paul. Orders were given to send men down the street toward the house below Ovaim's. The men hurried to obey, shadows among shadows. More sacrifices, Paul thought. We want live prisoners, one of the guard officers hissed. The sound was a vision echo in Paul's ears. He went with solid precision here, vision/reality, tick for tick. Ornithopters drifted down across the moon. The night was full of Imperial troopers attacking. A soft hiss grew out of the other sounds, climbed to a roar while they still heard the sibilance. He picked up a terracotta glow that hid the stars, engulfed the moon. Paul, knowing that sound and glow from the earliest nightmare glimpses of his vision, felt an odd sense of fulfillment. It went the way it must. Stone burner, someone screamed. Stone burner, the cry was all around him. Stone burner, stone burner. Because it was required of him, Paul threw a protective arm across his face, dove for the low lip of a curb. It already was too late, of course. Where Ovaim's house had been, there stood now a pillar of fire. a blinding jet roaring at the heavens. It gave off a dirty brilliance which threw into sharp relief every ballet movement of the fighting and fleeing men, the tipping retreat of ornithopters. For every member of this frantic throng it was too late. The ground grew hot beneath Paul. He heard the sound of running stop. Men threw themselves down all around him, every one of them aware that there was no point in running. The first damage had been done, and now they must wait out the extent of the stone burner's potency. The thing's radiation, which no man could outrun, already had penetrated their flesh. The peculiar result of stone burner radiation already was at work in them. What else this weapon might do now lay in the planning of the men who had used it, the men who had defied the great convention to use it. Gods, a stone burner, someone whimpered. I don't want to be blind. Who does? The harsh voice of a trooper far down the street. But Clay-Laxi will sell many eyes here, someone near Paul growled. Now shut up and wait. They waited. Paul remained silent, thinking what this weapon implied. Too much fuel in it, and it had cut its way deep into the planet's core. Dune's molten level lay deep, but the more dangerous for that. Such pressures released and out of control might split a planet, scattering lifeless bits and pieces through space. I think it's dying down a bit, someone said. It's just digging deeper, Paul cautioned. Stay put, all of you. Stilgar will be sending help. Stilgar got away? Stilgar got away. The ground's hot, someone complained. They dared use atomics, a trooper near Paul protested. The sound's diminishing, someone down the street said. Paul ignored the words, concentrated on his fingertips against the street. He could feel the rolling rumbling of the thing. Deep, deep. My eyes, someone cried. I can't see. Someone closer to it than I was, Paul thought. He still could see to the end of the cul-de-sac when he lifted his head, for there was a mistiness across the scene. A red-yellow glow filled the area where Ovaim's house and its neighbour had been. Pieces of adjoining buildings made dark patterns as they crumpled into the glowing pit. Paul climbed to his feet. He felt the stone burner die, silence beneath him. His body was wet with perspiration against the steel suit's slickness, too much for the suit to accommodate. The air he drew into his lungs carried the heat and sulphur stench of the burner. As he looked at the troopers beginning to stand up around him, the mist on Paul's eyes faded into darkness. He summoned up his oracular vision of these moments, then turned and strode along the track that time had carved for him, fitting himself into the vision so tightly that it could not escape. He felt himself grow aware of this place as a multitudinous possession, reality welded to prediction. Moans and groans of his troopers arose all around him as the men realized their blindness. Hold fast, Paul shouted. Help is coming. And as the complaints persisted, he said, This is Muad'Dib. I command you to hold fast. Help comes. Silence. Then, true to his vision, a nearby guardsman said, Is it truly the Emperor? Which of you can see? Tell me. None of us has eyes, Paul said. They have taken my eyes as well, but not my vision. I can see you standing there, a dirty wall within touching distance on your left. Now wait bravely. Stilgar comes of our friends. The flock of many thopters grew louder all around. There was the sound of hurrying feet. Paul watched his friends come, matching their sounds to his oracular vision. Stilgar, Paul shouted, waving an arm. Over here. Thanks to Shai Halud, Stilgar cried, running up to Paul. You're not. In the sudden silence, Paul's vision showed him Stilgar staring with an expression of agony at the ruined eyes of his friend and emperor. Oh, my lord, Stilgar groaned. Yusul, Yusul, Yusul. What of the stone burner? One of the newcomers shouted. It's ended, Paul said, raising his voice. He gestured. Get up there now and rescue the ones who are closest to it. Put up barriers. Lively now. He turned back to Stilgar. Do you see, my lord? Stilgar asked, wonder in his tone. How can you see? For answer, Paul put a finger out to touch Stilgar's cheek above the stillsuit mouth cap, felt tears. You need give no moisture to me, old friend, Paul said. I am not dead. But your eyes, they've blinded my body, but not my vision, Paul said. Ah, still, I live in an apocalyptic dream. My steps fit into it so precisely that I fear most of all I will grow bored reliving the thing so exactly. Yusul, I don't. Don't try to understand it. Accept it. I am in the world beyond this world here. For me, they are the same. I need no hand to guide me. I see every movement all around me. I see every expression on your face. I have no eyes, yet I see. Stilgar shook his head sharply. Sire, we must conceal your affliction from. We hide it from no man, Paul said. By the law. We live by the Atreides law now, still. The Fremen law that the blind should be abandoned in the desert applies only to the blind. I am not blind. I live in the cycle of being where the war of good and evil has its arena. We are at a turning point in the succession of ages, and we have our parts to play. In a sudden stillness, Paul heard one of the wounded being led past him. It was terrible, the man groaned. A great fury of fire. None of these men shall be taken into the desert, Paul said. You hear me still? I hear you, my lord. They are to be fitted with new eyes at my expense. It will be done, my lord. Paul, hearing the awe grow in Stilgar's voice, said, I will be at the command, Fopter. Take charge here. Yes, my lord. Paul stepped around Stilgar, strode down the street. His vision told him every movement, every irregularity beneath his feet, every face he encountered. He gave orders as he moved, pointing to men of his personal entourage, calling out names, summoning to himself the ones who represented the intimate apparatus of government. He could feel the terror grow behind him, the fearful whispers. His eyes, but he looked right at you, called you by name. At the command, Fopter, he deactivated his personal shield, reached into the machine and took the microphone from the hand of a startled communications officer, issued a swift string of orders, thrust the microphone back into the officer's hand. Turning, Paul summoned the weapons specialist, one of the eager and brilliant new breed who remembered siege life only dimly. They used a stone burner, Paul said. After the briefest pause, the man said, So I was told, sire. You know what that means, of course. The fuel could only have been atomic. Paul nodded, thinking of how this man's mind must be racing. Atomics. The Great Convention prohibited such weapons. Discovery of the perpetrator would bring down the combined retributive assault of the great houses. Old feuds would be forgotten, discarded in the face of this threat and the ancient fears it aroused. It cannot have been manufactured without leaving some traces, Paul said. You will assemble the proper equipment and search out the place where the stone burner was made. At once, sire. With one last fearful glance, the man sped away. My lord, the communications officer ventured from behind him. Your eyes. Paul turned, reached into the Fopter, returned the command set to his personal band. Call Chani, he ordered. Tell her I am alive and will be with her soon. Now the forces gather, Paul thought, and he noted how strong was the smell of fear in the perspiration all around. He has gone from Alia to womb of heaven. Holy, holy, holy. 5 sand leagues, confront our Lord. He can see, without eyes, a demon upon him. Holy, holy, holy. Equation he solved for martyrdom. The moon falls down, songs of Muad'Dib. After 7 days of radiating fevered activity, the keep took on an unnatural quiet. On this morning, there were people about, but they spoke in whispers, heads close together, and they walked softly. Some scurried with an oddly furtive gait. The sight of a guard detail coming in from the forecourt drew questioning looks and frowns at the noise which the newcomers brought with their tramping about and stacking of weapons. The newcomers caught the mood of the interior, though, and began moving in that furtive way. Talk of the stone burner still floated around. He said the fire had blue-green in it and a smell out of hell. Elpa is a fool. He says he'll commit suicide rather than take Tleilaxu eyes. I don't like talk of eyes. Muad'Dib passed me and called me by name. How does he see without eyes? People are leaving. Had you heard? There's great fear. The Naibs say they'll go to Siege Macabre for a grand council. What have they done with the panegyrist? I saw them take him into the chamber where the Naibs are meeting. Imagine Korba a prisoner. Shani had arisen early, awakened by a stillness in the keep. Awakening, she'd found Paul sitting up beside her, his eyeless sockets aimed at some formless pace beyond the far wall of their bedchamber. What the stone burner had done with its peculiar affinity for eye tissue, all that ruined flesh had been removed. Injections and unguents had saved the stronger flesh around the sockets, but she felt that the radiation had gone deeper. Ravenous hunger seized her as she sat up. She fed on the food kept by the bedside, spice bread, a heavy cheese. Paul gestured at the food. Beloved, there was no way to spare you this. Believe me. Chani stilled a fit of trembling when he aimed those empty sockets at her. She'd given up asking him to explain. He spoke so oddly. I was baptized in sand, and it cost me the knack of believing. Who trades in faiths anymore? Who'll buy? Who'll sell? What could he mean by such words? He refused even to consider Tleilaxu eyes, although he bought them with a lavish hand for the men who'd shared his affliction. Hunger satisfied, Chani slipped from bed, glanced back at Paul, noted his tiredness. Grim lines framed his mouth. The dark hair stood up, mussed from a sleep that hadn't healed. He appeared so saturnine and remote. The back and forth of waking and sleeping did nothing to change this. She forced herself to turn away, whispered, My love, my love. He leaned over, pulled her back into the bed, kissed her cheeks. "Soon we'll go back to our desert," he whispered. "Only a few things remain to be done here." She trembled at the finality of his voice. He tightened his arms around her, murmured, "Don't fear me, my Sahaya. Forget mystery and accept love. There's no mystery about love. It comes from life. Can't you feel that?" "Yes." She put a palm against his chest, counting his heartbeats. His love cried out to the Fremen spirit in her, torrential, outpouring, savage. A magnetic power enveloped her. "I promise you a thing, beloved," he said. "A child of ours will rule such an empire that mine will fade in comparison. Such achievements of living and art and sublime. We're here now," she protested, fighting a dry sob, "and I feel we have so little time. We have eternity, beloved. You may have eternity. I have only now. But this is eternity." He stroked her forehead. She pressed against him, lips on his neck. The pressure agitated the life in her womb. She felt it stir. Paul felt it too. He put a hand on her abdomen, said, "Ah, little ruler of the universe, wait your time. This moment is mine." She wondered then why he always spoke of the life within her as singular. Hadn't the medics told him? She searched back in her own memory, curious that the subject had never arisen between them. Surely he must know she carried twins. She hesitated on the point of raising this question. He must know. He knew everything. He knew all the things that were herself. His hands, his mouth, all of him knew her. Presently she said, "Yes, love, this is forever. This is real." And she closed her eyes tightly lest sight of his dark sockets stretched her soul from paradise to hell. No matter the Rouhani magic in which he'd enciphered their lives, his flesh remained real, his caresses could not be denied. When they rose to dress for the day, she said, "If the people only knew your love." But his mood had changed. "You can't build politics on love," he said. "People aren't concerned with love. It's too disordered. They prefer despotism. Too much freedom breeds chaos. We can't have that, can we? And how do you make despotism lovable?" "You're not a despot," she protested, tying her scarf. "Your laws are just." "Ah, laws," he said. He crossed to the window, pulled back the draperies as though he could look out. "What's law? Control? Law filters chaos and what drips through. Serenity? Law, our highest ideal and our basest nature. Don't look too closely at the law. Do, and you'll find the rationalized interpretations of legal casuistry, the precedents of convenience. You'll find the serenity, which is just another word for death." Johnny's mouth drew into a tight line. She couldn't deny his wisdom and sagacity, but these moods frightened her. He turned upon himself, and she sensed internal wars. It was as though he took the Fremen maxim, never to forgive, never to forget, and whipped his own flesh with it. She crossed to his side, stared past him at an angle. The growing heat of the day had begun pulling the north wind out of these protected latitudes. The wind painted a false sky full of ochre plumes and sheets of crystal, strange designs in rushing gold and red. High and cold, the wind broke against the shield wall with fountains of dust. Paul felt Chinese warmth beside him. Momentarily he lowered a curtain of forgetfulness across his vision. He might just be standing here with his eyes closed. Time refused to stand still for him, though. He inhaled darkness, starless, tearless. His affliction dissolved substance until all that remained was astonishment at the way sounds condensed his universe. Everything around him leaned on his lonely sense of hearing, falling back only when he touched objects. The drapery, Chinese hand. He caught himself listening for Chinese breaths. Where was the insecurity of things that were only probable, he asked himself. His mind carried such a burden of mutilated memories. For every instant of reality there existed countless projections, things fated never to be. An invisible self within him remembered the false pasts, their burden threatening at times to overwhelm the present. Chani leaned against his arm. He felt his body through her touch, dead flesh carried by time eddies. He reeked of memories that had glimpsed eternity. To see eternity was to be exposed to eternity's whims, oppressed by endless dimensions. The oracle's false immortality demanded retribution. Past and future became simultaneous. Once more the vision arose from its black pit, locked onto him. It was his eyes. It moved his muscles. It guided him into the next moment, the next hour, the next day, till he felt himself to be always there. "It's time we were going," Chani said. "The council. Alia will be there to stand in my place. Does she know what to do? She knows." Alia's day began with a guard squadron swarming into the parade yard below her quarters. She stared down at a scene of frantic confusion, clamorous and intimidating babble. The scene became intelligible only when she recognized the prisoner they'd brought, Korba, the panegyrist. She made her morning toilet, moving occasionally to the window, keeping watch on the progress of impatience down there. Her gaze kept straying to Korba. She tried to remember him as the rough and bearded commander of the Third Wave in the Battle of Arakeen. It was impossible. Korba had become an immaculate fop, dressed now in a Peroto silk robe of exquisite cut. It lay open to the waist, revealing a beautifully laundered ruff and embroidered undercoat set with green gems. A purple belt gathered the waist. The sleeves poking through the robe's armhole slits had been tailored into rivulet ridges of dark green and black velvet. A few naibs had come out to observe the treatment accorded the fellow Fremen, had brought on the clamour, exciting Korba to protest his innocence. Alia moved her gaze across the Fremen faces, trying to recapture memories of the original men. The present blotted out the past. They'd all become hedonists, samplers of pleasures most men couldn't even imagine. Their uneasy glances she saw straight off into the doorway into the chamber where they would meet. They were thinking of Muad'Dib's blind sight, a new manifestation of mysterious powers. By their law, a blind man should be abandoned in the desert, his water given up to Shai Hulud. But eyeless Muad'Dib saw them. They disliked buildings too, and felt vulnerable in space built above the ground. Give them a proper cave cut from rocks, then they could relax. But not here, not with this new Muad'Dib waiting inside. As she turned to go down to the meeting, she saw the letter where she'd left it on a table by the door, the latest message from their mother. Despite the special reverence held for Caladan as the place of Paul's birth, the Lady Jessica had emphasized her refusal to make her planet a stop on the Hajj. No doubt my son is an epochal figure of history, she'd written, but I cannot see this as an excuse for submitting to a rabble invasion. Alia touched the letter, experienced an odd sensation of mutual contact. This paper had been in her mother's hands. Such an archaic device, the letter, but personal in a way no recording could achieve. Written in the Atreides battle tongue, it represented an almost invulnerable privacy of communication. Thinking of her mother afflicted Alia with the usual inward burning. The spice change that had mixed the psyches of mother and daughter forced her at times to think of Paul as a son to whom she had given birth. The capsule complex of oneness could present her own father as a lover. Ghost shadows cavorted in her mind, people of possibility. Alia reviewed the letter as she walked down the ramp to the antechamber where her guard Amazons waited. You produce a deadly paradox, Jessica had written. Government cannot be religious and self-assertive at the same time. Religious experience needs a spontaneity which laws inevitably suppress, and you cannot govern without laws. Your laws eventually must replace mortality, replace conscience, replace even the religion by which you think to govern. Sacred ritual must spring from praise and holy yearnings which hammer out a significant morality. Government, on the other hand, is a cultural organism particularly attractive to doubts, questions, and contentions. I see the day coming when ceremony must take the place of faith, and symbolism replaces morality. The smell of spiced coffee greeted Alia in the antechamber. 4 guard Amazons in green watch robes came to attention as she entered. They fell into step behind her, striding firmly in the bravado of their youth, eyes alert for trouble. They had zealot faces untouched by awe. They radiated that special Fremen quality of violence. They could kill casually with no sense of guilt. In this I am different, Alia thought. The Atreides name has enough dirt on it without that. Word preceded her. A waiting page started off as she entered the lower hall, running to summon the full guard detail. The hall stretched out windowless and gloomy, illuminated only by a few subdued glow globes. Abruptly, the doors to the parade yard opened wide at the far end to admit a glaring shaft of daylight. The guard with Korba in their midst wavered into view from the outside with the light behind them. Where is Stilgar? Alia demanded. Already inside, one of her Amazons said. Alia led the way into the chamber. It was one of the keep's more pretentious meeting places. A high balcony with rows of soft seats occupied one side. Across from the balcony, orange draperies had been pulled back from tall windows. Bright sunlight poured through from an open space with a garden and a fountain, and the rear end of the chamber at her right stood a dais with a single massive chair. Moving to the chair, Alia glanced back and saw the gallery filled with naibs. Household guardsmen packed the open space beneath the gallery, Stilgar moving among them with a quiet word here, a command there. He gave no sign that he'd seen Alia enter. Korba was brought in, seated at a low table with cushions beside it on the chamber floor below the dais. Despite his finery, the panegyrist gave the appearance now of a surly, sleepy old man huddled up in his robes as against the outer cold. 2 guardsmen took up positions behind him. Stilgar approached the dais as Alia seated herself. Where is Muad'Dib? He asked. My brother has delegated me to preside as Reverend Mother, Alia said. Hearing this, the naibs in the gallery began raising their voices in protest. Silence, Alia commanded. In the abrupt quiet, she said, Is it not Fremen law that a Reverend Mother presides when life and death are at issue? As the gravity of her statement penetrated, stillness came over the naibs, but Alia marked angry stares across the rows of faces. She named them in her mind for discussion in council. Hobars, Rajifiri, Tasman, Sajid, Umbu, Leg. The names carried pieces of Dune in them. Umbu, Siege, Tasman, Sink, Hobar's Gap. She turned her attention to Korba. Observing her attention, Korba lifted his chin, said, I protest my innocence. Stilgar, read the charges, Alia said. Stilgar produced a brown spice paper scroll, stepped forward. He began reading, a solemn flourish in his voice as though to hidden rhythms. He gave the words an incisive quality, clear and full of probity. Then that you did conspire with traitors to accomplish the destruction of our Lord and Emperor, that you did meet in vile secrecy with diverse enemies of the realm, that you... Corba kept shaking his head with a look of pained anger. Alia listened broodingly, chin planted on her left fist, head cocked to that side, the other arm extended along the chair arm. Bits of the formal procedure began dropping out of her awareness, screened by her own feelings of disquiet. Venerable tradition, support of the legions in all Fremen everywhere, violence met with violence, according to the law, majesty of the imperial person, forfeit all rights to... It was nonsense, she thought. Nonsense, all of it. Nonsense, nonsense, nonsense. Stilgar finished. Thus the issue is brought to judgment. In the immediate silence, Corporal rocked forward, hands gripping his knees, veined neck stretched as though he were preparing to leap. His tongue flicked between his teeth as he spoke. Not by word or deed have I been traitor to my Fremen vows. I demand to confront my accuser. A simple enough protest, Alia thought, and she saw that it had produced a considerable effect on the Naibs. They knew Corba. He was one of them. To become a Naib, he'd proved his Fremen courage and caution. Not brilliant Corba, but reliable. Not one to lead a jihad, perhaps, but a good choice as supply officer. Not a crusader, but one who cherished the old Fremen virtues. The tribe is paramount. Avaim's bitter words as Paul had recited them swept through Alia's mind. She scanned the gallery. Any of those men might see himself in Corba's place, some for good reason, but an innocent Naib was as dangerous as a guilty one here. Corba felt it too. Who accuses me? He demanded. I have a Fremen right to confront my accuser. Perhaps you accuse yourself, Alia said. Before he could mask it, mystical terror lay briefly on Corba's face. It was there for anyone to read. With her powers, Alia had but to accuse him herself, saying she brought the evidence from the Shadow region, the Alam al-Mifal. Our enemies have Fremen allies, Alia pressed. Water traps have been destroyed, Ganats blasted, plantings poisoned, and storage basins plundered, and now they've stolen a worm from the desert, taken it to another world. The voice of this intrusion was known to all of them. Muad'Dib. Paul came through the doorway from the hall, pressed through the guard ranks and crossed to Alia's side. Chani, accompanying him, remained on the sidelines. "My lord," Stilgar said, refusing to look at Paul's face. Paul aimed his empty sockets at the gallery, then down to Corba. "What, Corba? No words of praise?" Muttering could be heard in the gallery. It grew louder, isolated words and phrases audible. Law for the blind. Fremen way. In the desert. Who breaks? "Who says I'm blind?" Paul demanded. He faced the gallery. "You, Rajafiri? I see you're wearing gold today, and that blue shirt beneath it which still has dust on it from the streets. You always were untidy." Rajafiri made a warning gesture, 3 fingers against evil. "Point those fingers at yourself," Paul shouted. "We know where the evil is." He turned back to Corba. "There's guilt on your face, Corba. Not my guilt. I may have associated with the guilty, but no." He broke off, shot a frightened look at the gallery. Taking a cue from Paul, Alia arose, stepped down to the floor of the chamber, advanced to the edge of Corba's table. From a range of less than a metre, she stared down at him, silent and intimidating. Corba cowered under the burden of eyes. He fidgeted, shot anxious glances at the gallery. "Whose eyes do you seek up there?" Paul asked. "You cannot see," Corba blurted. Paul put down a momentary feeling of pity for Corba. The man lay trapped in the vision snare as securely as any of those present. He played a part, no more. "I don't need eyes to see you," Paul said, and he began describing Corba, every movement, every twitch, every alarmed and pleading look at the gallery. Desperation grew in Corba. Watching him, Alia saw he might break any second. Someone in the gallery must realize how near he was to breaking, she thought. Who? She studied the faces of the Naibs, noting small betrayals in the masked faces, angers, fears, uncertainties, guilts. Paul fell silent. Corba mustered a pitiful air of pomposity to plead. "Who accuses me?" "Avaim accuses you," Alia said. "But Avaim's dead," Corba protested. "How did you know that?" Paul asked. "Through your spy system?" "Oh yes, we know about your spies and couriers. We know who brought the stone burner here from Tarahel." "It was for the defense of the Kizarate," Corba blurted. "Is that how it got into traitorous hands?" Paul asked. "It was stolen, and we..." Corba fell silent, swallowed. His gaze darted left and right. "Everyone knows I've been the voice of love for Muad'Dib." He stared at the gallery. "How can a dead man accuse a Fremen?" "Ovaim's voice isn't dead," Alia said. She stopped as Paul touched her arm. "Ovaim sent us his voice," Paul said. "It gives the names, the acts of treachery, the meeting places and the times. Do you miss certain faces in the Council of Naibs, Corba? Ra, Merkur, and Fash. Keek the lame isn't with us today, and Takim, where is he? Korba shook his head from side to side. They fled Arrakis with the stolen worm, Paul said. Even if I freed you now, Korba, Shai Halud would have your water for your part in this. Why don't I free you, Korba? Think of all those men whose eyes were taken, the men who cannot see as I see. They have families and friends, Korba. Where could you hide from them? It was an accident, Korba pleaded. Anyway, they're getting Tleilaxu. Again he subsided. Who knows what bondage goes with metal eyes? Paul asked. The Nibes in their gallery began exchanging whispered comments, speaking behind raised hands. They gazed coldly at Korba now. Defense of the Khazar-8, Paul murmured, returning to Korba's plea. A device which either destroys a plane or produces J-rays to blind those too near it. Which effect, Korba, did you conceive as a defense? Does the Khazar-8 rely on stopping the eyes of all observers? It was a curiosity, my lord, Korba pleaded. We knew the old law said that only families could possess atomics, but the Khazar-8 obeyed you, Paul said. A curiosity indeed. Even if it's only the voice of my accuser, he must face me with it, Korba said. A Fremen has rights. He speaks truth, sire, Stilgar said. Alia glanced sharply at Stilgar. The law is the law, Stilgar said. Sensing Alia's protest, he began quoting Fremen law, interspersing his own comments on how the law pertained. Alia experienced the odd sensation that she was hearing Stilgar's words before he spoke them. How could he be this credulous? Stilgar had never appeared more official and conservative, more intent on adhering to the Dune Code. His chin was outthrust, aggressive, his mouth dropped. Was there really nothing in him but this outrageous pomposity? Korba is a Fremen and must be judged by Fremen law, Stilgar concluded. Alia turned away, looked out at the day shadows dropping down the wall across from the garden. She felt drained by frustration, but dragged his thing along well into mid-morning. Now what? Korba had relaxed. The Panegyrist's manner said he'd suffered an unjust attack, but everything he'd done had been for the love of Muad'Dib. She glanced at Korba, surprised a look of sly self-importance sliding across his face. He might almost have received a message, she thought. He acted the part of a man who'd heard friends shout, "Hold fast, help is on its way." For an instant they'd held this thing in their hands, the information out of the dwarf, the clues that others were in the plot, the names of informants, but the critical moment had flown. Stilgar? Surely not Stilgar. She turned, stared at the old Fremen. Stilgar met her gaze without flinching. Thank you, Stil, Paul said, for reminding us of the law. Stilgar inclined his head. He moved close, shaped silent words in a way he knew both Paul and Alia could read. I'll wring him dry, and then take care of the matter. Paul nodded, signaled the guardsman behind Korba. Remove Korba to a maximum security cell, Paul said. No visitors except counsel. As counsel, I appoint Stilgar. Let me choose my own counsel, Korba shouted. Paul whirled. You deny the fairness and judgment of Stilgar? Oh no, my lord, but take him away, Paul barked. The guardsman lifted Korba off the cushions, herded him out. With new mutterings, the knives began quitting their gallery. Attendants came from beneath the gallery, crossed to the windows and drew the orange draperies. Orange gloom took over the chamber. Paul, Alia said. When we precipitate violence, Paul said, it'll be when we have full control of it. Thank you, Stil. You played your part well. Alia, I'm certain, has identified the knives who were with him. They couldn't help giving themselves away. You cooked this up between you? Alia demanded. Had I ordered Corpus slain out of hand, the knives would have understood, Paul said, but this formal procedure without strict adherence to Fremen law. They felt their own rights threatened. Which knives are with him, Alia? Rajafiri for certain, she said, voice low, and Sajid, but give Stilgar the complete list, Paul said. Alia swallowed in a dry throat, sharing the general fear of Paul in this moment. She knew how he moved among them without eyes, but the delicacy of it daunted her. To see their forms in the air of his vision, she sensed her persons shimmering for him in a sidereal time whose accord with reality depended entirely on his words and actions. He held them all in the palm of his vision. It's past time for your morning audience, sire, Stilgar said. Many people, curious, afraid. Are you afraid still? It was barely a whisper. Yes. You're my friend and have nothing to fear from me, Paul said. Stilgar swallowed. Yes, my lord. Alia, take the morning audience, Paul said. Stilgar, give the signal. Stilgar obeyed. A flurry of movement erupted at the great doors. A crowd was pressed back from the shadowy room to permit entrance of officials. Many things began happening all at once. The household guard elbowing and shoving back the press of supplicants, garishly robed pleaders trying to break through, shouts, curses. Pleaders waved the papers of their calling. The clerk of the assemblage strode ahead of them Through the opening cleared by the guard, he carried the list of preferences, those who'd be permitted to approach the throne. The clerk, a wiry Fremen named Tekrub, carried himself with weary cynicism, flaunting his shaven head, clumped whiskers. Alia moved to intercept him, giving Paul time to slip away with Chani through the private passage behind the dais. She experienced a momentary distrust of Tekrub at the prying curiosity in the stare he sent after Paul. "I speak for my brother today," she said. "Have the supplicants approach one at a time." "Yes, my lady." He turned to arrange his throng. "I can remember a time when you wouldn't have mistaken your brother's purpose here," Stilgar said. "I was distracted," she said. "There's been a dramatic change in you still. What is it?" Stilgar drew himself up, shocked. Unchanged, of course, but dramatically? This was a particular view of himself that he'd never encountered. Drama was a questionable thing. Imported entertainers of dubious loyalty and more dubious virtue were dramatic. Enemies of the Empire employed drama in their attempts to sway the fickle populace. Korba had slipped away from Fremen virtues to employ drama for the Khazarite, and he'd die for that. "You're being perverse," Stilgar said. "Do you distrust me?" The distress in his voice softened her expression, but not her tone. "You know I don't distrust you. I've always agreed with my brother that once matters were in Stilgar's hands you could safely forget them. Then why do you say I've changed?" "You're preparing to disobey my brother," she said. "I can read it in you. I only hope it doesn't destroy you both." The first of the pleaders and supplicants were approaching now. She turned away before Stilgar could respond. His face, though, was filled with the things she'd sensed in her mother's letter, the replacement of morality and conscience with law. "You produce a deadly paradox." Tabana was an apologist for Socratic Christianity, probably a native of 4 Anbus who lived between the 8th and 9th centuries before Corono, likely in the second reign of Dalamak. Of his writings, only a portion survives, from which this fragment is taken. The hearts of all men dwell in the same wilderness. From the Dune Book of Irulan. "You are Bijaz," the Gola said, entering the small chamber where the dwarf was held under guard. "I am called Heet." A strong contingent of the household guard had come in with the Gola to take over their evening watch. Sand carried by the sunset wind had stung their cheeks while they crossed the outer yard, and made them blink in a hurry. They could be heard in the passage outside now, exchanging the banter and ritual of their tasks. "You are not Heet," the dwarf said. "You are Duncan Idaho. I was there when they put your dead flesh into the tank, and I was there when they removed it, alive and ready for training." The Gola swallowed in a throat suddenly dry. The bright glow globes of the chamber lost their yellowness in the room's green hangings. The light showed beads of perspiration on the dwarf's forehead, but Jazz seemed a creature of odd integrity, as though the purpose fashioned into him by the Tleilaxu was projected through his skin. There was power beneath the dwarf's mask of cowardice and frivolity. "Muad'Dib has charged me to question you to determine what it is the Tleilaxu intend you to do here," Heet said. "Tleilaxu, Tleilaxu," the dwarf sang. "I am the Tleilaxu, you dolt. For that matter, so are you." Heet stared at the dwarf. Bijaz radiated a charismatic alertness that made the observer think of ancient idols. "You hear that guard outside?" Heet asked. "If I gave them the order, they'd strangle you." "Hi, hi," Bijaz cried. "What a callous lout you've become. And you said you came seeking truth." Heet found he didn't like the look of secret repose beneath the dwarf's expression. "Perhaps I only seek the future," he said. "Well spoken," Bijaz said. "Now we know each other. When two thieves meet, they need no introduction." "So we're thieves," Heet said. "What do we steal?" "Not thieves, but dice," Bijaz said. "And you came here to read my spots. I, in turn, read yours. And yo, you have 2 faces." "Did you really see me go into the Tleilaxu tanks?" Heet asked, fighting an odd reluctance to ask that question. "Did I not say it?" Bijaz demanded. The dwarf bounced to his feet. "We had a terrific struggle with you. The flesh did not want to come back." Heet felt suddenly that he existed in a dream controlled by some other mind, that he might momentarily forget this to become lost in the convolutions of that mind. Bijaz tipped his head slyly to one side, walked all around the Gola, staring up at him. "Excitement kindles old patterns in you," Bijaz said. "You are the pursuer who doesn't want to find what he pursues." "You're a weapon aimed at Muad'Dib," Heet said, swiveling to follow the dwarf. "What is it you're to do?" "Nothing," Bijaz said, stopping. "I give you a common answer to a common question." "Then you are aimed at Alia," Heet said. "Is she your target?" "They call her Hort, the fish monster, on the Outworlds," Bijaz said. "How is it I hear your blood boiling when you speak of her?" "So they call her Hort," the Gola said, studying Bijaz for any clue to his purpose. The dwarf made such odd responses. "She is the virgin harlot, Bijaz said. She is vulgar, witty, knowledgeable to a depth that terrifies, cruel when she is most kind, unthinking while she thinks, and when she seeks to build, she is as destructive as a Coriolis storm. So you came here to speak out against Dahlia, Hayat said. Against her? Bijaz sank to a cushion against the wall. I came here to be captured by the magnetism of her physical beauty, he grinned, a saurian expression in the big-featured face. To attack Alia is to attack her brother, Hayat said. That is so clear it is difficult to see, Bijaz said. In truth, Ember and Sister are one person back to back, one being half male and half female. That is a thing we've heard said by the Fremen of the deep desert, Hayat said, and those are the ones who revived the blood sacrifice to Shai Hulud. How is it you repeat their nonsense? You dare say nonsense? Bijaz demanded. You, who are both man and mask? Ah, but the dice cannot read their own spots. I forget this. And you are doubly confused because you serve the Atreides double being. Your senses are not as close to the answer as your mind is. Do you preach that false ritual about Muad'Dib to your guards? Hayat asked, his words low. He felt his mind being tangled by the dwarf's words. They preach to me, Bijaz said, and they pray. Why should they not? All of us should pray. Do we not live in the shadow of the most dangerous creation the universe has ever seen? Dangerous creation. Their own mother refuses to live on the same planet with them. Why don't you answer me straight out? Hayat demanded. You know we have other ways of questioning you. We'll get our answers, one way or another. But I have answered you. Have I not said the myth is real? And am I the wind that carries death in its belly? No, I am words. Such words as the lightning which strikes from the sand in a dark sky. I have said, blow out the lamp, day is here, and you keep saying, give me a lamp so I can find the day. You play a dangerous game with me, Hayat said. Did you think I could not understand these Ensuni ideas? You leave tracks as clear as those of a bird in mud. Bijaz began to giggle. Why do you laugh? Hayat demanded. Because I have teeth and wish I had not, Bijaz managed between giggles. Having no teeth, I could not gnash them. And now I know your target, Hayat said. You were aimed at me, and I've hit it right on, Bijaz said. You made such a big target, how could I miss? He nodded as though to himself. Now I will sing to you. He began to hum, a keening, whining, monotonous theme, repeated over and over. Hayat stiffened, experiencing odd pains that played up and down his spine. He stared at the face of the dwarf, seeing youthful eyes in an old face. The eyes were the centre of a network of knobby white lines, which ran to the hollows below his temples. Such a large head. Every feature focused on the pursed-up mouth from which the monotonous noise issued. The sound made Hayat think of ancient rituals, folk memories, old worlds and customs, half-forgotten meanings and lost mutterings. Something vital was happening here, a bloody play of ideas across time. Elder ideas lay tangled in the dwarf's singing. It was like a blazing light in the distance, coming nearer and nearer, illuminating life across a span of centuries. What are you doing to me? Hayat gasped. You are the instrument I was taught to play, Bijaz said. I am playing you. Let me tell you the names of the other traitors among the Naibs. They are Biguros, Kayuit. There is Jedida, who was secretary to Korba. There is Abu Mojandis, the aide to Banerjee. Even now, one of them could be sinking a blade into your Muad'Dib. Hayat shook his head from side to side. He found it too difficult to talk. We are like brothers, Bijaz said, interrupting his monotonous hum once more. We grew in the same tank. I first and then you. Hayat's metal eyes inflicted him with a sudden burning pain. Flickering red haze surrounded everything he saw. He felt he had been cut away from every immediate sense except the pain, and he experienced his surroundings through a thin separation like wind-blown gauze. All had become accident, the chance involvement of inanimate matter. His own will was no more than a subtle shifting thing. It lived without breath and was intelligible only as an inward illumination. With a clarity born of desperation, he broke through the gauze curtain with the lonely sense of sight. His attention focused like a blazing light onto Bijaz. Hayat felt that his eyes cut through layers of the dwarf, seeing the little man as a hired intellect, and beneath that, a creature imprisoned by hungers and cravings, which lay huddled in the eyes, layer after layer, until finally there was only an entity aspect being manipulated by symbols. We are upon a battleground, Bijaz said. You may speak of it. His voice freed by the command, Hayat said, You cannot force me to slay Muad'Dib. I have heard the Bene Gesserit say, Bijaz said, but there is nothing firm, nothing balanced, nothing durable in all the universe, but nothing remains in its state, that each day, sometimes each hour, brings change. Hayat shook his head dumbly from side to side. You believed the silly emperor was the prize we sought, Bijaz said. How little do you understand our masters, Vitlalaksu. The Guild and Bene Gesserit believe we produce artifacts. In reality, we produce tools and services. Anything can be a tool. Poverty, war. War is useful because it is effective in so many areas. It stimulates the metabolism. It enforces government. It diffuses genetic strains. It possesses a vitality such as nothing else in the universe. Only those who recognize the value of war and exercise it have any degree of self-determination. In an oddly placid voice, Hayat said, "Strange thoughts coming from you, almost enough to make me believe in a vengeful providence. What restitution was exacted to create you? It would make a fascinating story, doubtless of an even more extraordinary epilogue." "Magnificent," Bijaz chortled. "You attack, therefore you have willpower and exercise self-determination. You are trying to awaken violence in me," Hayat said in a panting voice. Bijaz denied this with a shake of the head. "Awaken, yes. Violence, no. You are a disciple of awareness by training, so you have said. I have an awareness to awaken in you, Duncan Idaho." Hayat, Duncan Idaho, killer extraordinary, lover of many women, swordsman soldier, Atreides' field hand on the field of battle. Duncan Idaho. The past cannot be awakened. Cannot? It has never been done. True, but our masters defied the idea that something cannot be done. Always they seek the proper tool, the right application of effort, the services of the proper. You hide your real purpose. You threw up a screen of words and they mean nothing. There is a Duncan Idaho in you, Bijaz said. It will submit to emotion or to dispassionate examination, but submit it will. This awareness will rise through a screen of suppression and selection out of the dark past which dogs your footsteps. It goads you even now while it holds you back. There exists that being within you upon which awareness must focus and which you will obey. The Tleilaxu think I'm still their slave, but I... Quiet, slave, Bijaz said in that whining voice. Hayat found himself frozen in silence. Now we are down to bedrock, Bijaz said. I know you feel it. And these are the power words to manipulate you. I think they will have sufficient leverage. Hayat felt the perspiration pouring down his cheeks, the trembling of his chest and arms, but he was powerless to move. One day, Bijaz said, the Emperor will come to you. He will say, "She is gone." The grief mask will occupy his face. He will give water to the dead, as they call their tears hereabouts. And you will say, using my voice, "Master, oh master." Hayat's jaw and throat ached with the locking of his muscles. He could only twist his head in a brief arc from side to side. He will say, "I carry a message from Bijaz." The dwarf grimaced. Poor Bijaz, who has no mind. Poor Bijaz, a drum stuffed with messages, an essence for others to use. Pound on Bijaz, and he produces a noise. Again he grimaced. You think me a hypocrite, Duncan Idaho. I am not. I can grieve, too, but the time has come to substitute swords for words. A hiccup shook Hayat. Bijaz giggled then. Ah, thank you. Duncan, thank you. The demands of the body save us. As the Emperor carries the blood of the Harkonnens in his veins, he will do as we demand. He will turn into a spitting machine, a biter of words that ring with a lovely noise to our masters. Hayat blinked, thinking how the dwarf appeared like an alert little animal, a thing of spite and rare intelligence. Harkonnen blood in the Atreides? You think of Beast Raban, the vile Harkonnen, and you glare, Bijaz said. You are like the Fremen in this. When words fail, the sword is always at hand, eh? You think of the torture inflicted upon your family by the Harkonnens, and through his mother, your precious Paul is a Harkonnen. You would not find it difficult to slay a Harkonnen now, would you? A bit of frustration coursed through the Gola. Was it anger? Why should this cause anger? Oh, Bijaz said, and click, click. There is more to the message. It is a trade that Tleilaxu offer your precious Paul Atreides. Our masters will restore his beloved, a sister to yourself, another Gola. Hayat thought suddenly that he existed in a universe occupied only by his own heartbeats. A Gola, Bijaz said. It will be the flesh of his beloved. She will bear his children. She will love only him. We can even improve on the original if he so desires. Did ever a man have greater opportunity to regain what he'd lost? It is a bargain he will leave to strike. Bijaz nodded, eyes drooping as though tiring. Then he will be tempted, and in his distraction you will move close. In the instant you will strike. 2 Golas, not 1. That is what our masters demand. The dwarf cleared his throat, nodded once more, said, "Speak. I will not do it." Hayat said, "But Duncan Idaho would," Bijaz said. It will be the moment of supreme vulnerability for this descendant of the Harkonnens. Do not forget this. You will suggest improvements to his beloved, perhaps a deathless heart, gentler emotions. You will offer asylum as you move close to him, a planet of his choice somewhere beyond the Imperium. Think of it, his beloved restored. No more need for tears, and a place of idols to live out his years. A costly package, Hayat said, probing. He'll ask the price. Tell him he must renounce his godhood and discredit the Khazarite. He must discredit himself, his sister. Nothing more? Hayat asked, sneering. He must relinquish his charm holdings, naturally, And if you're not yet close enough to strike, speak of how much the Tleilaxu admire what he has taught them about the possibilities of religion. Tell him the Tleilaxu have a department of religious engineering, shaping religions to particular needs. How very clever, Hayat said. You think yourself free to sneer and disobey me, Bijaz said. He cocked his head slyly to one side. Don't deny it. They made you well, little animal, Hayat said. And you as well, the dwarf said. You will tell him to hurry. Flesh decays, and her flesh must be preserved in a cryological tank. Hayat felt himself floundering, caught in a matrix of objects he could not recognize. But Dwarf appeared so sure of himself. There had to be a flaw in the Tleilaxu logic. In making their goal up, it keyed him to the voice of Bijaz, but what? Logic/matrix/object? How easy it was to mistake clear reasoning for correct reasoning. Was Tleilaxu logic distorted? Bijaz smiled, listened as though to a hidden voice. Now you will forget, he said. When the moment comes, you will remember. He will say, she is gone. Duncan Idaho will awaken then. The dwarf clapped his hands together. Hayat grunted, feeling that he had been interrupted in the middle of a thought, or perhaps in the middle of a sentence. What was it? Something about targets? You think to confuse me and manipulate me, he said. How is that? Bijaz asked. I am your target and you can't deny it, Hayat said. I would not think of denying it. What is it you try to do with me? A kindness, Bijaz said. A simple kindness. The sequential nature of actual events is not illuminated with lengthy precision by the powers of prescience, except under the most extraordinary circumstances. The oracle grasps incidents cut out of the historic chain. Eternity moves. It inflicts itself upon the oracle and the supplicant alike. Let Muad'Dib's subjects doubt his majesty and his oracular visions. Let them deny his powers. Let them never doubt eternity. The Dune Gospels. Hayat watched Alia emerge from her temple and cross the plaza. Her guard was bunched close, fierce expressions on their faces to mask the lines moulded by good living and complacency. A heliograph of Thopter wings flashed in the bright afternoon sun above the temple, part of the royal guard with Muad'Dib's fist symbol on its fuselage. Hayat returned his gaze to Alia. She looked out of place here in the city, he thought. Her proper setting was the desert, open, untrammeled space. An odd thing about her came back to him as he watched her approach. Alia appeared thoughtful only when she smiled. It was a trick of the eyes, he decided, recalling a cameo memory of her as she had appeared at the reception for the Guild Ambassador, haughty against a background of music and brittle conversation among extravagant gowns and uniforms. And Alia had been wearing white, dazzling, a bright garment of chastity. He had looked down upon her from a window as she crossed an inner garden with its formal pond, its fluting fountains, fawns of pampas, grass, and a white belvedere. Entirely wrong, all wrong. She belonged in the desert. Hayat drew in a ragged breath. Alia had moved out of his view then, as she did now. He waited, clenching and unclenching his fists. The interview with Bijaz had left him uneasy. He heard Alia's entourage pass outside the room where he waited. She went into the family quarters. Now he tried to focus on the thing about her which troubled him. The way she'd walked across the plaza? Yes. She'd moved like a hunted creature fleeing some predator. He stepped out onto the connecting balcony, walked along it behind the plasmoed sunscreen, stopped all still in concealing shadows. Alia stood at the balustrade overlooking her temple. He looked where she was looking, out over the city. He saw rectangles, blocks of colour, creeping movements in life and sound. Structures gleamed, shimmered. Heat patterns spiraled off the rooftops. There was a boy across the way bouncing a ball in a cul-de-sac formed by a buttressed massif at a corner of the temple, back and forth as the ball went. Alia too watched the ball. She felt a compelling identity with that ball, back and forth, back and forth. She sensed herself bouncing through corridors of time. The potion of melange she drained just before leaving the temple was the largest she'd ever attempted, a massive overdose. Even before beginning to take effect, it had terrified her. Why did I do it? She asked herself. One made a choice between dangers. Was that it? This was the way to penetrate the fog spread over the future by that damnable Dune tarot. A barrier existed. It must be breached. She had acted out of a necessity to see where it was her brother walked with his eyeless stride. The familiar melange fugue state began creeping into her awareness. She took a deep breath, experienced a brittle form of calm, poised and selfless. Possession of second sight has a tendency to make one a dangerous fatalist, she thought. Unfortunately, there existed no abstract leverage, no calculus of prescience. Visions of the future could not be manipulated as formulas. One had to enter them, risking life and sanity. A figure moved from the harsh shadows of the adjoining balcony. The Gola. In her heightened awareness, Alia saw him with intense clarity, the dark, lively features dominated by those glistening metal eyes. He was a union of terrifying opposites, something put together in a shocking linear way. He was shadow and blazing light, a product of the process which had revived his dead flesh, and of something intensely pure, innocent. He was innocence under siege. "Have you been there all along, Duncan?" she asked. "So I'm to be Duncan," he said. "Why? Don't question me," she said, and she thought, looking at him, that the Tleilaxu had left no corner of their Gola unfinished. "Only gods can safely risk perfection," she said. "It's a dangerous thing for a man." "Duncan died," he said, wishing she would not call him that. "I am Hayat." She studied his artificial eyes, wondering what they saw. Observed closely, they betrayed tiny black pockmarks, little wells of darkness in their glittering metal. Facets. The universe shimmered around her and lurched. She steadied herself with a hand on the sun-warmed surface of the balustrade. "Ah." The melange moved swiftly. "Are you ill?" Hayat asked. He moved closer. The steely eyes opened wide, staring. Who spoke? She wondered. Was it Duncan Idaho? Was it the Mentat Gola or the Zensuni philosopher? Or was it a Tleilaxu pawn more dangerous than any guild steersman? Her brother knew. Again, she looked at the Gola. There was something inactive about him now, a latent something. He was saturated with rating and with powers beyond their common life. "Out of my mother, I am like the Bene Gesserit," she said. "Do you know that?" "I know it. I use their powers, think as they think. Part of me knows the sacred urgency of the breeding program, and its products." She blinked, feeling part of her awareness begin to move freely in time. "It said that the Bene Gesserit never let go," he said, and he watched her closely, noting how white her knuckles were where she gripped the edge of the balcony. "Have I stumbled?" she asked. He marked how deeply she breathed, with tension in every movement, the glazed appearance of her eyes. "When you stumble," he said, "you may regain your balance by jumping beyond the thing that tripped you." "The Bene Gesserit stumbled," she said. "Now they wish to regain their balance by leaping beyond my brother. They want Chani's baby. Or mine. Are you with child?" She struggled to fix herself in a time-space relationship to this question. With child? When? Where? "I see my child," she whispered. She moved away from the balcony's edge, turned her head to look at the Gola. He had a face of salt, bitter eyes, 2 circles of glistening lead, and as he turned away from the light to follow her movement, blue shadows. "What do you see with such eyes?" she whispered. "What other eyes see?" he said. His words rang in her ears, stretching her awareness. She felt that she reached across the universe. Such a stretching. Out. Out. She lay intertwined with all time. "You've taken the spice, a large dose," he said. "Why can't I see him?" she muttered. The womb of all creation held her captive. "Tell me, Duncan, why I cannot see him." "Who can't you see?" "I cannot see the father of my children. I'm lost in a tarot fog. Help me." Mentat logic offered its prime computation, and he said, "The Bene Gesserit want a mating between you and your brother. It would lock the genetic." A wail escaped her. "The egg in the flesh," she gasped. A sensation of chill swept over her, followed by intense heat. The unseen mate of her darkest dreams. Flesh of her flesh that the oracle could not reveal. Would it come to that? "Have you risked a dangerous dose of the spice?" he asked. Something within him fought to express the utmost terror at the thought that an Atreides woman might die, that Paul might face him with the knowledge that a female of the royal family had gone. "You don't know what it's like to hunt the future," she said. "Sometimes I glimpse myself, but I get in my own way. I cannot see through myself." She lowered her head, shook it from side to side. "How much of the spice did you take?" he asked. "Nature abhors prescience," she said, raising her head. "Did you know that, Duncan?" He spoke softly, reasonably, as to a small child. "Tell me how much of the spice you took." He took hold of her shoulder with his left hand. "Words are such gross machinery, so primitive and ambiguous," she said. She pulled away from his hand. "You must tell me," he said. "Look at the shield wall," she commanded, pointing. She sent her gaze along her own outstretched hand, trembled as the landscape crumbled in an overwhelming vision. A sandcastle destroyed by invisible waves. She averted her eyes, was transfixed by the appearance of the Gola's face. His features crawled, became aged, then young. Aged, young. He was life itself, assertive, endless. She turned to flee, but he grabbed her left wrist. "I'm going to summon a doctor," he said. "No, you must let me have the vision. I have to know. You are going inside now," he said. She stared down at the hand. Where their flesh touched, she felt an electric presence that both lured and frightened her. She jerked free, gasped. "You can't hold the whirlwind. You must have medical help," he snapped. "Don't you understand?" she demanded. "My vision's incomplete, just fragments. It flickers and jumps. I have to remember the future.
Can't you see that? What is the future if you die? He asked, forcing her gently into the family chambers. Words, words, she muttered. I can't explain it. One thing is the occasion of another thing, but there's no cause, no effect. We can't leave the universe as it was. Try as we may, there's a gap. Stretch out here, he commanded. He is so dense, she thought. Cool shadows enveloped her. She felt her own muscles crawling like worms, a firm bed that she knew to be insubstantial. Only space was permanent. Nothing else had substance. The bed flowed with many bodies, all of them her own. Time became a multiple sensation, overloaded. It presented no single reaction for her to abstract. It was time. It moved. The whole universe slipped backward, forward, sideways. It has no thing aspect, she explained. You can't get under it or around it. There's no place to get leverage. There comes a fluttering of people all around her. Someone held her left hand. She looked at her own moving flesh, followed a twining arm out to a fluid mask of face. Duncan, Idaho. His eyes were wrong, but it was Duncan. Child, man, adolescent. Child, man, adolescent. Every line of his features betrayed concern for her. Duncan, don't be afraid, she whispered. He squeezed her hand, nodded. Be still, he said, and he thought, she must not die, she must not. No Atreides woman can die. He shook his head sharply. Such thoughts defied mentat logic. Death was a necessity that life might continue. The Gola loves me, Alia thought. The thought became bedrock to which she might cling. He was a familiar face with a solid room behind him. She recognized one of the bedrooms in Paul's suite. A fixed, immutable person did something with a tube in her throat. She fought against retching. We got her in time, a voice said, and she recognized the tones of a family medic. You should have called me sooner. There was suspicion in the medic's voice. She felt the tube slide out of her throat. A snake, a shimmering cord. The slap shot will make her sleep, the medic said. I'll send one of her attendants too. I will stay with her, the Gola said. That is not seemly, the medic snapped. Stay, Duncan, Alia whispered. He stroked her hand to tell her he'd heard. Milady, the medic said, it'd be better if you did not tell me what is best, she rasped. Her throat ached with each syllable. Milady, the medic said, a voice accusing. You know the dangers of consuming too much melange. I can only assume someone gave it to you without. You are a fool, she rasped. Would you deny me my visions? I knew what I took and why. She put a hand to her throat. Leave us, at once. The medic pulled out of her field of vision, said, I will send word to your brother. She felt him leave, turned her attention to the Gola. The vision lay clearly in her awareness now, a culture medium in which the present outgrew outward. She sensed the Gola move in that play of time, no longer cryptic, fixed now against a recognizable background. He is the crucible, she thought. He is danger and salvation. And she shuddered, knowing she saw the vision her brother had seen. Unwanted tears burned her eyes. She shook her head sharply. No tears. They wasted moisture and, worse, distracted the harsh flow of vision. Paul must be stopped. Once, just once, she had bridged time to place her voice where he would pass. But stress and mutability would not permit that here. The web of time passed through her brother now like rays of light through a lens. He stood at the focus and he knew it. He had gathered all the lines to himself and would not permit them to escape or change. Why? She muttered. Is it hate? Does he strike out at time itself because it hurt him? Is that it? Hate? Thinking he heard her speak his name, the Gola said, Milady? If I could only burn this thing out of me, she cried. I didn't want to be different. Please, Alia, he murmured. Let yourself sleep. I wanted to be able to laugh, she whispered. Tears slid down her cheeks. But I'm sister to an emperor who's worshipped as a god. People fear me. I never wanted to be feared. He wiped the tears from her face. I don't want to be part of history, she whispered. I just want to be loved, and to love. You are loved, he said. Ah, loyal, loyal Duncan, she said. Please don't call me that, he pleaded. But you are, she said, and loyalty is a valued commodity. It can be sold, not bought, but sold. I don't like your cynicism, he said. Damn your logic. It's true. Sleep, he said. Do you love me, Duncan? She asked. Yes. Is that one of those lies? She asked. One of the lies that are easier to believe than the truth? Why am I afraid to believe you? You fear my differences as you fear your own. Be a man, not a mentat, she snarled. I am a mentat and a man. Will you make me your woman then? I will do what love demands. And loyalty? And loyalty. That's where you're dangerous, she said. Her words disturbed him. No sign of the disturbance arose to his face. No muscle trembled, but she knew it. Vision memory exposed for disturbance. She felt she had missed part of the vision, though, that she should remember something else from the future. There existed another perception which did not go precisely by the senses, a thing which fell into her head from nowhere, the way prescience did. It lay in the time shadows, infinitely painful. Emotion, that was it. Emotion. It had appeared in the vision, not directly, but as a product from which she could infer what lay behind. She had been possessed by emotion, a single constriction made up of fear, grief, and love. They lay there in the vision, all collected into a single epidemic body, overpowering and primordial. "Duncan, don't let me go," she whispered. "Sleep," he said. "Don't fight it. I must. I must. He's the bait in his own trap. He's the servant of power and terror. Violence. Deification is a prison enclosing him. He'll lose everything. It'll tear him apart. You speak of Paul? They drive him to destroy himself," she gasped, arching her back. "Too much weight. Too much grief. They seduce him away from love." She sank back to the bed. "They're creating a universe where he won't permit himself to live." "Who is doing this?" "He is. Oh, you're so dense. He's part of the pattern, and it's too late. Too late. Too late." As she spoke, she felt her awareness descend, layer by layer. It came to rest directly behind her navel. Body and mind separated and merged in a storehouse of relic visions. Moving, moving. She heard a fatal heartbeat, a child of the future. The melange still possessed her, then, setting her adrift in time. She knew she had tasted the life of a child not yet conceived. One thing certain about this child, it would suffer the same awakening she had suffered. It would be an aware, thinking entity before birth. There exists a limit to the force even the most powerful may apply without destroying themselves. Judging this limit is the true artistry of government. Misuse of power is the fatal sin. The law cannot be a tool of vengeance, never a hostage nor a fortification against the martyrs it has created. You cannot threaten any individual and escape the consequences. Muad'Dib Law, the Stilgar Commentary. Chani stared out at the morning desert framed in the fault cleft below Siege Tabor. She wore no stillsuit, and this made her feel unprotected here in the desert. The Siege Grotto's entrance lay hidden in the buttressed cliff above and behind her. The desert. The desert. She felt that the desert had followed her wherever she had gone. Coming back to the desert was not so much a homecoming as a turning around to see what had always been there. A painful constriction surged through her abdomen. The birth would be soon. She fought down the pain, wanting this moment alone with her desert. Dawn stillness gripped the land. Shadows fled among the dunes and terraces of the shield wall all around. Daylight lunged over the high scarp and plunged her up to her eyes in a bleak landscape, stretching beneath a washed blue sky. The scene matched the feeling of dreadful cynicism which had tormented her since the moment she'd learned of Paul's blindness. Why are we here? She wondered. It was not a hajra, a journey of seeking. Paul sought nothing here except perhaps a place for her to give birth. He had summoned odd companions for this journey, she thought. Bijaz, the Tleilaxu dwarf, the Gola, Hayat, who might be Duncan Idaho's revenant, Edric, the guild steersman ambassador, Gaius Helen Mahayim, the Bene Gesserit reverend mother he so obviously hated, Likna, Oviam's strange daughter, who seemed unable to move beyond the watchful eyes of guards, Stilgar, her uncle of the Naibs, and his favourite wife Hara, and Irulan, Alia. The sound of wind through the rocks accompanied her thoughts. The desert day had become yellow on yellow, tan on tan, grey on grey. Why such a strange mixture of companions? We have forgotten, Paul had said in response to her question, that the word company originally meant travelling companions. We are a company, but what value are they? There, he'd said, turning his frightful sockets toward her. We've lost that clear single note of living. If it cannot be bottled, beaten, pointed, or hoarded, we give it no value. Hurt, she'd said, that's not what I meant. Ah, dearest one, he'd said, soothing, we are so money-rich and so life-poor. I am evil, obstinate, stupid. You are not. That, too, is true. But my hands are blue with time. I think I tried to invent life, not realizing it had already been invented. And he touched her abdomen to feel the new life there. Remembering, she placed both hands over her abdomen and trembled, sorry that she'd asked Paul to bring her here. The desert wind had stirred up evil odours from the fringed plantings which anchored the dunes at the cliff base. Fremen superstition gripped her. Evil odours, evil times. She faced into the wind, saw a worm appear outside the plantings. It arose like the prow of a demon ship out of the dunes, fresh sand, smelled of a water deadly to its kind, and fled beneath a long burrowing mound. She hated the water then, inspired by the worm's fear. Water, once the spirit soul of Arrakis, had become a poison. Water brought pestilence. Only the desert was clean. Below her, a Fremen work gang appeared. They climbed to the siege's middle entrance, and she saw that they had muddy feet. Fremen of muddy feet. The children of the siege began singing to the morning above her, their voices piping from the upper entrance. The voices made her feel time fleeing from her like hawks before the wind. She shuddered. What storm did Paul see with his eyeless vision? She sensed a vicious madman in him, someone weary of songs and polemics. The sky, she noted, had become crystal grey, filled with alabaster rays, bizarre designs sketched across the heavens by wind-borne sand. A line of gleaming white in the south caught her attention. Eyes suddenly alerted, she interpreted the sign. White sky in the south, Shai Hulud's mouth. A storm came, big wind. She felt the warning breeze, a crystal blowing of sand against her cheeks. The incense of death came on the wind, odours of water flowing in qanats, sweating sand, flint, the water. That was why Shai Hulud sent his Coriolis wind. Hawks appeared in the cleft where she stood, seeking safety from the wind. They were brown as the rocks and with scarlet in their wings. She felt her spirit go out to them. They had a place to hide. She had none. "Milady, the wind comes." She turned, saw the Gola calling to her outside the upper entrance in the siege. To the siege. Fremen fears gripped her. Clean death and the body's water claimed for the tribe. These she understood, but something brought back from death. Wind-blown sand whipped at her, reddened her cheeks. She glanced over her shoulder at the frightful band of dust across the sky. The desert beneath the storm had taken on a tawny, restless appearance, as though dune waves beat on a tempest shore the way Paul had once described a sea. She hesitated, caught by a feeling of the desert's transience. Measured against eternity, this was not more than a cold cauldron. Dune surf thundered against cliffs. The storm out there had become a universal thing for her, all the animals hiding from it, nothing left of the desert but its own private sounds. Blown sand scraping along rock, a wind surge whistling, the gallop of a boulder tumbled suddenly from its hill. Then, somewhere out of sight, a capsized worm thumping its idiot way aright and slithering off to its dry depths. It was only a moment as her life measured time, but in that moment she felt this planet being swept away, cosmic dust, part of other waves. "We must hurry," the Gola said from right beside her. She sensed fear in him then, concern for her safety. "It'll shred the flesh from your bones," he said, as though he needed to explain such a storm to her. Her feat of him dispelled by his obvious concern, Chani allowed the Gola to help her up the rock stairway to the siege. They entered the twisting baffle which protected the entrance. Attendants opened the moisture seals, closed them behind. Siege odours assaulted her nostrils. The place was a ferment of nasal memories, the warren closeness of bodies, rank ester of the reclamation stills, familiar food aromas, the flinty burning of machines at work, and through it all, the omnipresent spice, melange everywhere. She took a deep breath. Home. The Gola took his hand from her arm, stood aside, a patient figure now, almost as though turned off when not in use. Yet, he watched. Chani hesitated in the entrance chamber, puzzled by something she could not name. This was truly her home. As a child, she'd hunted scorpions here by glow-globe light. Something was changed, though. "Shouldn't you be going to your quarters, milady?" the Gola asked. As though ignited by his words, a rippling birth constriction seized her abdomen. She fought against revealing it. "Milady," the Gola said. "Why is Paul afraid for me to bear our children?" she asked. "It is a natural thing to fear for your safety," the Gola said. She put a hand to her cheek where the sand had reddened it. "And he doesn't fear for the children? Milady, you cannot think of a child without remembering that your firstborn was slain by the Sardaukar." She studied the Gola. Flat face, unreadable mechanical eyes. Was he truly Duncan Idaho, this creature? Was he friend to anyone? Had he spoken truthfully now? "You should be with the medics," the Gola said. Again she heard the fear for her safety in his voice. She felt abruptly that her mind lay undefended, ready to be invaded by shocking perceptions. "Hayat, I'm afraid," she whispered. "Where is my Yusul?" "Affairs of state detain him," the Gola said. She nodded, thinking of the government apparatus which had accompanied them in a great flight of ornithopters. Abruptly, she realized what puzzled her about the siege. Outworld odors. The clerks and aides had brought their own perfumes into this environment, aromas of dyed and clothing, of exotic toiletries. There were an undercurrent of odors here. Shani shook herself, concealing an urge to bitter laughter. Even the smells changed in Muad'Dib's presence. There were pressing matters which he could not defer, the Gola said, misreading her hesitation. Yes, I understand. I came with that swarm too." Recalling the flight from Marrakeen, she admitted to herself now, but she had not expected to survive it. Paul had insisted on piloting his own Thopter. Eyeless, he had guided the machine here. After that experience, she knew nothing he did could surprise her. Another pain fanned out through her abdomen. The Gola saw her indrawn breath. The tightening of her cheeks said, "Is it your time?" "Yes, it is. You must not delay," he said. He grasped her arm, hurried her down the hall. She sensed panic in him, said, "There's time." He seemed not to hear. "The Zansuni approach to birth," he said, urging her even faster, "is to wait without purpose in the state of highest tension. Do not compete with what is happening. To compete is to prepare for failure. Do not be trapped by the need to achieve anything. This way, you achieve everything." While he spoke, they reached the entrance to her quarters. He thrust her through the hangings, cried out, "Hara! Hara! It is Chani's time! Summon the medics!" His call brought attendants running. There was a great bustling of people in which Chani felt herself an isolated island of calm, until the next pain came. Hate, dismissed to the outer passage, took time to wonder at his own actions. He felt fixated at some point of time where all truths are only temporary. Panic lay beneath his actions, he realized. Panic centered not on the possibility that Chani might die, but that Paul should come to him afterward. filled with grief, his loved one, gone, gone. Something cannot emerge from nothing, the Gold told himself. From what does this panic emerge? He thought that his mental faculties had been dulled, let out a long, shuddering breath. A psychic shadow passed over him. In the emotional darkness of it, he felt himself waiting for some absolute sound, the snap of a branch in a jungle. A sigh shook him. Danger had passed without striking. Slowly, marshalling his powers, shedding bits of inhibition, he sank into mentat awareness. He forced it, not the best way, but somehow necessary. Ghost shadows moved within him in place of people. He was a trans-shipping station for every datum he had ever encountered. His being was inhabitability. They passed in review to be compared, judged. Perspiration broke out on his forehead. Thoughts with fuzzy edges feathered away into darkness. Unknown. Infinite systems. A mentat could not function without realizing he worked in infinite systems. Fixed knowledge could not surround the infinite. Everywhere could not be brought into finite perspective. Instead, he must become the infinite, momentarily. In one gestalten spasm, he added, seeing Bijaz seated before him, blazing from some inner fire. Bijaz! The dwarf had done something to him. Hate felt himself teetering on the lip of a deadly pit. He projected the mentat computation line forward, seeing what could develop out of his own actions. A compulsion, he gasped. I've been rigged with a compulsion. A blue-robed courier, passing as Hate spoke, hesitated. Did you say something, Sirrah? Not looking at him, the Gola nodded. I said everything. There was a man so wise, he jumped into a sandy place and burnt out both his eyes. When he knew his eyes were gone, he offered no complaint. He summoned up a vision and made himself a saint. Children's verse from History of Muad'Dib. Paul stood in darkness outside the siege. Oracular vision told him it was night. That moonlight silhouetted the shrine atop Chin Rock high on his left. This was a memory-saturated place, his first siege, where he and Chani... I must not think of Chani, he told himself. The filling cup of his vision told him of changes all around. A cluster of palms far down to the right, the black-silver line of a quinat carrying water through dunes piled up by that morning's storm, water flowing in the desert. He recalled another kind of water flowing in a river of his birth world, Caladan. He hadn't realized then the treasure of such a flow, even the murky slivering in a quinat across a desert basin. Treasure. With a delicate cough, an aide came up from behind. Paul held out his hands for a magnaboard with a single sheet of metallic paper on it. It moved as sluggishly as the Kanat's water. The vision flowed, but he found himself increasingly reluctant to move with it. Pardon, sire, the aide said. The Sembul Treaty. Your signature? I can read it, Paul snapped. He scrawled Atreides Impa in the proper place, returned the board, thrusting it directly into the aide's outstretched hand, aware of the fear this inspired. The man fled. Paul turned away. Ugly, barren land. He imagined it sun-soaked and monstrous with heat, a place of sand slides and the drowned darkness of dust pools, blow devils unreeling tiny dunes across the rocks, their narrow bellies full of ochre crystals. But it was a rich land too, big, exploding out of narrow places with vistas of storm-trodden emptiness, rampart cliffs and tumble-down ridges. All it required was water and love. Life changed those irascible wastes into shapes of grace and movement, he thought. That was the message of the desert. Contrast stunned him with realization. He wanted to turn to the aide's mast in the siege entrance, shout at them. If you need something to worship, then worship life, all life, every last crawling bit of it. We're all in this beauty together. They wouldn't understand. In the desert, they were endlessly desert. Growing things performed no green ballet for them. He clenched his fists at his sides, trying to halt the vision. He wanted to flee from his own mind. It was a beast come to devour him. Awareness lay in him, sodden, heavy with all the living it had sponged up, saturated with too many experiences. Desperately, Paul squeezed his thoughts outward. Stars. Awareness turned over at the thought of all those stars above him, an infinite volume. A man must be half mad to imagine he could rule even a teardrop of that volume. He couldn't begin to imagine the number of subjects his Imperium claimed. Subjects? Worshippers and enemies, more likely. Did any among them see beyond rigid beliefs? Where was one man who'd escaped the narrow destiny of his prejudices? Not even an emperor escaped. He'd lived to take everything life, tried to create a universe in his own image, but the exultant universe was breaking him at last with its silent waves. I spit on Dune, he thought. I give it my moisture. The myth he'd made out of intricate movements and imagination, out of moonlight and love, out of prayers older than Adam, and grey cliffs and crimson shadows, laments and rivers of martyrs, what had it come to at last? When the waves receded, the shores of time would spread out their clean spread out there, clean, empty, shining with infinite grains of memory and little else. Was this the golden genesis of man? Sand scuffed against rocks told him that the Gola had joined him. You've been avoiding me today, Duncan, Paul said. It's dangerous for you to call me that, the Gola said. I know. I came to warn you, my lord. I know. The story of the compulsion Bijaz had put on him poured from the Gola then. Do you know the nature of the compulsion? Paul asked. Violence. Paul felt himself arriving at a place which had claimed him from the beginning. He stood suspended. The jihad had seized him, fixed him onto a glide path from which the terrible gravity of the future would never release him. There'll be no violence from Duncan, Paul whispered. But, sire, tell me what you see around us, Paul said. My lord, the desert. How is it tonight? Don't you see it? I have no eyes, Duncan. But I've only my vision, Paul said, and wish I didn't have it. I'm dying of prescience. Did you know that, Duncan? Perhaps. What you fear won't happen, the Gola said. What? Deny my own oracle? How can I, when I've seen it fulfilled thousands of times? People call it a power, a gift. It's an affliction. It won't let me leave my life where I found it. My lord, the Gola muttered. It isn't. Young master, you don't... He fell silent. Paul sensed the Gola's confusion, said, What'd you call me, Duncan? What? For a moment, You called me young master. I did, yes. That's what Duncan always called me. Paul reached out, touched the Gola's face. Was that part of your Tleilaxu training? No. Paul lowered his hand. What then? It came from me. Do you serve two masters? Perhaps. Free yourself from the Gola, Duncan. How? You're human. Do a human thing. I'm a Gola, but your flesh is human. Duncan's in there. Something's in there. I care not how you do it, Paul said, but you'll do it. You've foreknowledge? Foreknowledge be damned. Paul turned away. His vision hurtled forward now, gaps in it, but it wasn't a thing to be stopped. My lord, if you've... Quiet! Paul held up a hand. Did you hear that? Hear what, my lord? Paul shook his head. Duncan hadn't heard it. Had he only imagined the sound? It had been his tribal name called from the desert, far away and low. Usul. Usul. What is it, my lord? Paul shook his head. He felt watched. Something out there in the night shadows knew he was here. Something? No, someone. It was mostly sweet, he whispered, and you were the sweetest of all. What do you say, my lord? It's the future, Paul said. The amorphous human universe out there had undergone a spurt of motion, dancing to the tune of his vision. It had struck a powerful note then. The ghost echoes might endure. I don't understand, my lord, the Gola said. A Fremen dies when he's too long from the desert, Paul said. They call it the water sickness. Isn't that odd? That's very odd. Paul strained at memories, tried to recall the sound of Chani breathing beside him in the night. Where is their comfort? He wondered. All he could remember was Chani at breakfast at the day they'd left for the desert. She'd been restless, irritable. Why do you wear that old jacket? She demanded, eyeing the black uniform coat with its red hawk crest beneath his Fremen robes. You're an emperor. Even an emperor has his favourite clothing, he'd said. For no reason he could explain, this had brought real tears to Chani's eyes, the second time in her life when Fremen inhibitions had been shattered. Now in the darkness, Paul rubbed his own cheeks, felt moisture there. Who gives moisture to the dead? He wondered. It was his own face, yet not his. The wind chilled the wet skin. A frail dream formed, broke. What was this swelling in his breast? Was it something he'd eaten? How bitter and plaintive was this other self, giving moisture to the dead? The wind bristled with sand. The skin, dry now, was his own. But whose was the quivering which remained? They heard the wailing then, far away in the siege depths. It grew louder, louder. The Gola whirled at a sudden glare of light, someone flinging wide the ancient seals. In the light, he saw a man with a raffish grin. No, not a grin, but a grimace of grief. It was a Fedaykin lieutenant named Tandus. Behind him came a press of many people, all fallen silent now that they saw Muad'Dib. Chani, Tandus said, is dead, Paul whispered. I heard her call. He turned toward the siege. He knew this place. It was a place where he could not hide. His onrushing vision illuminated the entire Fremen mob. He saw Tandus, felt the Fedaykin's grief, the fear and anger. She is gone, Paul said. The Gola heard the words out of a blazing corona. They burned his chest, his backbone, the sockets of his metal eyes. He felt his right hand move toward the knife at his belt. His own thinking became strange, disjointed. He was a puppet held fast by strings reaching down from that awful corona. He moved to another's commands and to another's desires. The strings jerked his arms, his legs, his jaw. Sounds came squeezing out of his mouth, a terrifying repetitive noise. Harak, harak, harak. The knife came up to strike. In that instant, he grabbed his own voice, shaped rasping words. "Run! Young master, run!" "We will not run," Paul said. "We'll move with dignity. We'll do what must be done." The goaler's muscles locked. He shuddered, swayed. What must be done? The words rolled in his mind like a great fish surfacing. What must be done? Ah! Fathead sounded like the old Duke, Paul's grandfather. The young master had some of the old man in him. What must be done? The words began to unfold in the goaler's consciousness. A sensation of living two lives simultaneously spread out through his awareness. Hate/Idaho/hate/Idaho. He became a motionless chain of relative existence, singular, alone. Old memories flooded his mind. He marked them, adjusted them to new understandings, made a beginning at the integration of a new awareness. A new persona achieved a temporary form of internal tyranny. The masculating synthesis remained charged with potential disorder, but events pressed into the temporary adjustment. The young master needed him. It was done then. He knew himself as Duncan Idaho, remembering everything of hate as though it had been stored secretly in him and ignited by a flaming catalyst. The corona dissolved. He shed the Tleilaxu compulsions. "Stay close to me, Duncan," Paul said. "I'll need to depend on you for many things." And as Idaho continued to stand entranced, "Duncan." "Yes, I am Duncan. Of course you are. This was the moment when you came back. We'll go inside now." Idaho fell into step beside Paul. It was like the old times, yet not like them. Now that he stood free of the Tleilaxu, he could appreciate what they had given him. Zensuni training permitted him to overcome the shock of events. The mentat accomplishment formed a counterbalance. He put off all fear, standing above the source. His entire consciousness looked outward from a position of infinite wonder. He had been dead, he was alive. "Sire," the Fadakan Tandis said as they approached him. "The woman, Lickner, says she must see you. I told her to wait." "Thank you," Paul said. "The birth, I spoke to the medics," Tandis said, falling into step. "They said you have 2 children, both of them alive and sound." "2?" Paul stumbled, caught himself in Idaho's arm. "A boy and a girl," Tandis said. "I saw them. They're good Fremen babies. How did she die?" Paul whispered. "My lord," Tandis bent close. "Chani?" Paul said. "It was the birth, my lord," Tandis husked. "They said her body was drained by the speed of it. I don't understand, but that is what they said." "Take me to her," Paul whispered. "My lord, take me to her." "That's where we're going, my lord." Again, Tandis bent close to Paul. "Why does your gaoler carry a bared knife?" "Duncan, put away your knife," Paul said. "The time for violence is past." As he spoke, Paul felt closer to the sound of his voice than to the mechanism which had created the sound. 2 babies. The vision had contained but one. Yet these moments went as the vision went. There was a person here who felt grief and anger. Someone. His own awareness lay in the grip of an awful treadmill, replaying his life from memory. 2 babies? Again he stumbled. Chani, he thought. There was no other way. "Chani, beloved, believe me that this death was quicker for you, and kinder. They'd have held our children hostage, displayed you in a cage in slave pits, reviled you with the blame for my death. This way we destroy them and save our children." Children? Once more he stumbled. "I permitted this," he thought. "I should feel guilty." The sound of noisy confusion filled the cavern ahead of them. It grew louder precisely as he remembered it growing louder. Yes, this was the pattern, the inexorable pattern, even of 2 children. "Chani is dead," he told himself. At some faraway instant in a past which he had shared with others, this future had reached down to him. It had chivied him and herded him into a chasm whose walls grew narrower and narrower. He could feel them closing in on him. This was the way the vision went. "Chani is dead. I should abandon myself to grief." But this was not the way the vision went. "Has Alia been summoned?" he asked. "She is with Chani's friends," Tanta said. Paul sensed the mob pressing back to give him passage. Their silence moved ahead of him like a wave. The noisy confusion began dying down. A sense of congested emotion filled the siege. He wanted to remove the people from his vision, found it impossible. Every face turning to follow him carried its special imprint. They were pitiless with curiosity, these faces, those faces. They felt grief, yes, but he understood the cruelty which drenched them. They were watching the articulate become dumb, the wise become a fool. Didn't the clown always appeal to cruelty? This was more than a death watch, less than a wake. Paul felt his soul begging for respite, but still the vision moved him. Just a little farther now, he told himself. Black, visionless dark awaited him just ahead. There lay the place ripped out of the vision by grief and guilt, the place where the moon fell. He stumbled into it, would have fallen had Idaho not taken his arm in a fierce grip, a solid presence knowing how to share his grief in silence. "Here is the place," Tanda said. "Watch your steps, sire," Idaho said, helping him over an entrance lip. Hangings brushed Paul's face. Idaho pulled him to a halt. Paul felt the room then, a reflection against his cheeks and ears. It was a rock-walled space with the rock hidden behind tapestries. "Where is Chani?" Paul whispered. Hara's voice answered him. "She is right here, Yusul." Paul heaved a trembling sigh. He had feared her body already had been removed to the stills where Fremen reclaimed the water of the tribe. Was that the way the vision went? He felt abandoned in his blindness. "The children?" Paul asked. "They are here too, my lord," Idaho said. "You have beautiful twins, Yusul," Hara said. "A boy and a girl. See, we have them here in a creche." 2 children, Paul thought wonderingly. The vision had contained only a daughter. He cast himself adrift from Idaho's arm, moved toward the place where Hara had spoken, stumbled into a hard surface. His hands explored. The metal-glass outlines of a creche. Someone took his left arm. "Yusul?" It was Hara. She guided his hands into the creche. He felt soft flesh. It was so warm. He felt ribs, breathing. "That is your son," Hara whispered. She moved his hand. "And this is your daughter." Her hand tightened on his. "Yusul, are you truly blind now?" He knew what she was thinking. The blind must be abandoned in the desert. Fremen tribes carried no dead weight. "Take me to Chani," Paul said, ignoring her question. Hara turned him, guided him to the left. Paul felt himself accepting now the fact that Chani was dead. He had taken his place in a universe he did not want, wearing flesh that did not fit. Every breath he drew bruised his emotions. 2 children. He wondered if he had committed himself to a passage where his vision would never return. It seemed unimportant. "Where is my brother?" It was Alia's voice behind him. He heard the rush of her, the overwhelming presence as she took his arm from Hara. "I must speak to you," Alia hissed. "In a moment," Paul said. "Now! It's about Likna." "I know," Paul said. "In a moment. You don't have a moment. I have many moments. But Chani doesn't." "Be still," he ordered. "Chani is dead." He put a hand across her mouth as she started to protest. "I order you to be still." He felt her subside and removed his hand. "Describe what you see," he said. "Paul!" Frustration and tears battled in her voice. "Never mind," he said, and he forced himself to inner stillness, opened the eyes of his vision to this moment. Yes, it was still here. Chani's body lay on a pallet within a ring of light. Someone had straightened her white robe, smoothed it trying to hide the blood from the birth. No matter, he could not turn his awareness from the vision of her face, such a mirror of eternity in the still features. He turned away, but the vision moved with him. She was gone, never to return. The air, the universe, all vacant, everywhere vacant. Was this the essence of his penance, he wondered? He wanted tears, but they would not come. Had he lived too long a Fremen? His step demanded its moisture. Nearby, a baby cried and was hushed. The sound pulled a curtain on his vision. Paul welcomed the darkness. This is another world, he thought. 2 children. The thought came out of some lost oracular trance. He tried to recapture the timeless mind elation of the melange, but awareness fell short. No burst of the future came into his new consciousness. He felt himself rejecting the future, any future. "Goodbye, my Sahaya," he whispered. Alia's voice, harsh and demanding, came from somewhere behind him. "I've brought Likna." Paul turned. "That's not Likna," he said. "That's a face dancer. Likna's dead. But hear what she says," Alia said. Slowly, Paul moved toward his sister's voice. "I'm not surprised to find you alive, Atreides." The voice was like Likna's, but with subtle differences, as though the speaker used Likna's vocal cords but no longer bothered to control them sufficiently. Paul found himself struck by an odd note of honesty in the voice. "Not surprised?" Paul asked. "I am Sightale, Tleilaxu of the Face Dancers, and I would know a thing before we bargain. Is that a Gola I see behind you, or Duncan Idaho?" "It's Duncan Idaho," Paul said, "and I will not bargain with you." "I think you will bargain," Sightale said. "Duncan," Paul said, speaking over his shoulder, "will you kill this Tleilaxu if I ask it?" "Yes, my lord." There was the suppressed rage of a berserker in Idaho's voice. "Wait," Alia said. "You don't know what you're rejecting." "But I do know," Paul said. "So it's truly Duncan Idaho of the Atreides," Sightale said. "We found the lever. A Gola can regain his past." Paul heard footsteps. Someone brushed past him on the left. Sightale's voice came from behind him now. "What do you remember of your past, Duncan?" "Everything. From my childhood on. I even remember you at the tank when they removed me from it," Idaho said. "Wonderful," Sightale breathed. "Wonderful." Paul heard the voice moving. "I need a vision," he thought. Darkness frustrated him. Bene Gesserit training warned him of a terrifying menace in Sightale, yet the creature remained a voice, a shadow of movement, entirely beyond him. "Are these the Atreides babies?" Sightale asked. "Hurrah!" Paul cried. "Get her away from there." "Stay where you are," Sightale shouted. "All of you. I warn you, a face dancer can move faster than you suspect. My knife can have both these lives before you touch me." Paul felt someone touch his right arm, then move off to the right. "That's far enough, Alia," Sightale said. "It's my fault," Alia groaned. "My fault." "Atreides," Sightale said. "Shall we bargain now?" Behind him, Paul heard a single hoarse curse. His throat constricted at the suppressed violence in Idaho's voice. Idaho must not break. Sightale would kill the babies. "To strike a bargain, one requires a thing to sell," Sightale said. "Not so, Atreides? Will you have your Chani back?" We can restore her to you. A Gola. Atreides. A Gola with full memory. But we must hurry. Call your friends to bring a cryologic tank to preserve the flesh. To hear Chani's voice once more, Paul thought. To feel her presence beside me. Ah, that's why they gave me Idaho as a Gola. To let me discover how much the recreation is like the original. But now, full restoration, at their price, I'd be a Tleilaxu tool forevermore. And Chani, chained to the same fate by a threat to our children, exposed once more to the Kizarate's plotting. What pressures would you use to restore Chani's memory to her? Paul asked, fighting to keep his voice calm. Would you condition her to kill one of her own children? We use whatever pressures we need, Scytale said. What say you, Atreides? Alia, Paul said, bargain with this thing. I cannot bargain with what I cannot see. A wise choice, Scytale gloated. Well, Alia, what do you offer me as your brother's agent? Paul lowered his head, bringing himself to stillness. Within stillness, he had glimpsed something just then, like a vision, but not a vision. It had been a knife close to him. There, give me a moment to think, Alia said. My knife is patient, Scytale said, but Chani's flesh is not. Take a reasonable amount of time. Paul felt himself blinking. It could not be, but it was. He felt eyes. Their vantage point was odd, and they moved in an erratic way. There! The knife swam into his view. With a breath-stilling shock, Paul recognized the viewpoint. It was that of one of his children. He was seeing Scytale's knife hand from within the creche. It glittered only inches from him. Yes, and he could see himself across the room as well, head down, standing quietly, a figure of no menace, ignored by the others in this room. To begin, you might assign us all your charm holdings, Scytale suggested. All of them? Alia protested. All. Watching himself through the eyes in the creche, Paul slipped his cries knife from its belt sheath. The movement produced a strange sensation of duality. He measured the distance, the angle. There'd be no second chance. He prepared his body then in the Bene Gesserit way, armed himself like a cocked spring for a single concentrated movement, a practitioner thing requiring all his muscles balanced in one exquisite unity. The crease knife leaped from his hand. The milky blur of it flashed into Scytale's right eye, jerked the face dancer's head back. Scytale threw both hands up and staggered backward against the wall. His knife clattered off the ceiling to hit the floor. Scytale rebounded from the wall. His face fell forward, dead before he touched the floor. He fell face forward, dead before he touched the floor. Still through the eyes in the creche, Paul watched the faces in the room turn toward his eyeless figure, read the combined shock. Then Alia rushed to the creche, bent over it, and hid the view from him. Oh, they're safe, Alia said. They're safe. My lord, Idaho whispered. Was that part of your vision? No. He waved a hand in Idaho's direction. Let it be. Forgive me, Paul, Alia said, but when that creature said they could revive, there are some prices an Atreides cannot pay, Paul said. You know that. I know, she sighed. But I was tempted. Who was not tempted? Paul asked. He turned away from them, groped his way to a wall, leaned against it, and tried to understand what he had done. How? How? The eye in the creche. He felt poised on the brink of terrifying revelation. My eyes, father. The word shapings shimmered before his sightless vision. My son, Paul whispered, too low for any to hear. You're aware. Yes, father. Look. Paul sagged against the wall in a spasm of dizziness. He felt that he'd been upended and drained. His own life whipped past him. He saw his father. He was his father. And the grandfather, and the grandfathers before that. His awareness tumbled through a mind-shattering corridor of his whole male line. How? He asked silently. Faint word shapings appeared, faded and were gone, as though the strain was too great. Paul wiped saliva from the corner of his mouth. He remembered the awakening of Alia in the Lady Jessica's womb, but there had been no water of life, no overdose of melange this time. Or had there? Had Chani's hunger been for that? Or was this somehow the genetic product of his line, foreseen by the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mahayim? Paul felt himself in the creche then, with Alia cooing over him. Her hand soothed him. Her face loomed, a giant thing directly over him. She turned him then, and he saw his creche companion, a girl of that bony-ribbed look of strength which came from a desert heritage. She had a full head of tawny red hair. As he stared, she opened her eyes. Those eyes. Chani peered out of her eyes, and the Lady Jessica. A multitude peered out of those eyes. Look at that, Alia said. They're staring at each other. Babies can't focus at this age, Hera said. I could, Alia said. Slowly, Paul felt himself being disengaged from that endless awareness. He was back at his own wailing wall then, leaning against it. Idaho shook his shoulder gently. My lord, let my son be called Leto for his father, Paul said, straightening. At the time of naming, Hera said, I will stand beside you as a friend of the mother and give that name. And my daughter, Paul said, let her be called Ganima. Usul, Hera objected. Ganima's an ill-omened name. It saved your life, Paul said. What matter that Ale made fun of you with that name? My daughter is Ganima, a spoil of war. Paul heard wheels squeak behind him then. the pallet with Chani's body being moved. The chant of the water rite began. Hal Yom, Hara said. I must leave now if I am to be the observer of the holy truth and stand beside my friend for the last time. Her water belongs to the tribe. Her water belongs to the tribe, Paul murmured. He heard Hara leave. He groped outward and found Idaho's sleeve. Take me to my quarters, Duncan. Inside his quarters, he shook himself free gently. It was a time to be alone, but before Idaho could leave there was a disturbance at the door. Master! It was Bajaz calling from the doorway. Duncan, Paul said. Let him come 2 paces forward. Kill him if he comes farther. Aya, Idaho said. Duncan, is it? Bajaz asked. Is it truly Duncan, Idaho? It is, Idaho said. I remember. Then Sightale's plan succeeded. Sightale is dead, Paul said. But I am not, and the plan is not, Bajaz said. By the tank in which I grew, it can be done. I shall have my pasts, all of them. It needs only the right trigger. Trigger? Paul asked. The compulsion to kill you. Idaho said, rage thick in his voice. Meant at computation. They found that I thought of you as the son I never had. Rather than slay you, the true Duncan Idaho would take over the Gola body. But it might have failed. Tell me, dwarf, if your plan had failed, if I'd killed him, what then? Oh, then we'd have bargained with the sister to save her brother. But this way the bargaining is better. Paul took a shuddering breath. He could hear the mourners moving down the last passage now toward the deep rooms and the water stills. It's not too late, my lord, Bajaz said. Will you have your love back? We can restore her to you. A Gola, yes. But now we hold out the full restoration. Shall we summon servants of a cryological tank, preserve the flesh of your beloved? It was harder now, Paul found. He had exhausted his powers in the first Tleilaxu temptation, and now all that was for nothing, to feel Chani's presence once more. Silence him, Paul told Idaho, speaking in Atreides' battle tongue. He heard Idaho move toward the door. Master, Bajaz squeaked. As you love me, Paul said, still in battle tongue, do me this favor. Kill him before I succumb. No! Bajaz screamed. The sound stopped abruptly with a frightened grunt. I did him the kindness, Idaho said. Paul bent his head, listening. He no longer could hear the mourners. He thought of the ancient Fremen rite being performed now deep in the siege, far down in the room of the deaf still, where the tribe recovered its water. There was no choice, Paul said. You understand that, Duncan? I understand. There are some things no one can bear. I meddled in all the possible futures I could create until finally they created me. My lord, you shouldn't. There are problems in this universe for which there are no answers, Paul said. Nothing can be done. As he spoke, Paul felt his link with the vision shatter. His mind cowered, overwhelmed by infinite possibilities. His lost vision became like the wind, blowing where it willed. We say of Muad'Dib that he has gone on a journey into that land where we walk without footprints. Preamble to the Khizarate Creed. There was a dike of water against the sand, an outer limit for the plantings of the siege holding. A rock bridge came next, and then the open desert beneath Idaho's feet. The promontory of Siege Tabor dominated the night sky behind him. The light of both moons frosted its high rim. An orchid had been brought right down to the water. Idaho paused on the desert side and stared back at flowered branches over silent water. Reflections in reality. 4 moons. The still suit felt greasy against his skin. Wet flint odors invaded his nostrils past the filters. There was a malignant simpering to the wind through the orchid. He listened for night sounds. Kangaroo mice inhabited the grass at the water verge. A hawk owl bounced his droning call into the cliff shadows. The wind-broken hiss of a sandfall came from the open bled. Idaho turned toward the sound. He could see no movement out there on the moonlit dunes. It was Tandis who had brought Paul this far. Then the man had returned to tell his account, and Paul had walked out into the desert, like a Fremen. He was blind, truly blind, Tandis had said, as though that explained it. Before that, he had the vision which he told to us, but a shrug. Blind Fremen were abandoned in the desert. Muad'Dib might be emperor, but he was also Fremen. Had he not made provision that Fremen guard and raise his children? He was Fremen. There was a skeleton desert here, Idaho saw. Moon-silvered ribs of rock showed through the sand. Then the dunes began. I should not have left him alone, not even for a minute, Idaho thought. I knew what was in his mind. He told me the future no longer needed his physical presence, Tandis had reported. When he left me, he called back. Now I am free, were his words. Damn them, Idaho thought. The Fremen had refused to send Thopters or searchers of any kind. Rescue was against their ancient customs. There will be a worm for Muad'Dib, they said. And they began the chant for those committed to the desert, the ones whose water went to Shai Hulud. Mother of sand, father of time, beginning of life, grant him passage. Idaho seated himself on a flat rock and stared at the desert. The night up there was filled with camouflage patterns. There was no way to tell where Paul had gone. Now I am free. Idaho spoke the words aloud, surprised by the sound of his own voice. For a time he let his mind run, remembering a day when he'd taken the child Paul to the sea market on Caladan, the dazzling glare of the sun and water, the sea's richest brought up dead, fair to be sold. Idaho remembered Gurney Halleck playing music of the balisette for them, pleasure, laughter. Rhythms pranced in his awareness, leading his mind like a thrall down channels of remembered delight. Gurney Halleck. Gurney would blame him for this tragedy. Memory music faded. He recalled Paul's words. There are problems in this universe for which there are no answers. Idaho began to wonder how Paul would die out there in the desert, quickly, killed by a worm. Slowly, in the sun, some of the Fremen back there in the siege had said Muad'Dib would never die, that he had entered the Ra world, where all possible futures existed, that he would be present henceforth in the Alam al-Mithal, wandering there endlessly even after his flesh had ceased to be. He'll die, and I'm powerless to prevent it, Idaho thought. He began to realize that there might be a certain fastidious courtesy in dying without a trace. No remains, nothing, and an entire planet for a tomb. Mentat, solve thyself, he thought. Words intruded on his memory, the ritual words of the Fedakan lieutenant, posting a guard over Muad'Dib's children. It shall be the solemn duty of the officer in charge. The plodding, self-important language of government enraged him. It had seduced the Fremen. It had seduced everyone. A man, a great man, was dying out there, but language plodded on, and on, and on. What had happened, he wondered, to all the clean meanings that screened out nonsense? Somewhere in some lost where which the Imperium had created, they'd been walled off, sealed against chance rediscovery. His mind quested for solutions, Mentat fashion. Patterns of knowledge glistened there. Lorelei hair might shimmer thus, beckoning the enchanted seaman into emerald caverns. With an abrupt start, Idaho drew back from catatonic forgetfulness. So, he thought, rather than face my failure, I would disappear within myself. The instant of that almost plunge remained in his memory. Examining it, he felt his life stretch out as long as the existence of the universe. Real flesh lay condensed, finite in its emerald cavern of awareness, but infinite life had shared his being. Idaho stood up, feeling cleansed by the desert. Sand was beginning to chatter in the wind, pecking at the surfaces of leaves in the orchard behind him. There was the dry and abrasive smell of dust in the night air. His robe whipped out to the pulse of a sudden gust. Somewhere far out in the bled, Idaho realized a mother storm raged, lifting vortices of winding dust in hissing violence. A giant worm of sand, powerful enough to cut flesh from bones. He will become one with the desert, Idaho thought. The desert will fulfill him. It was a Zen-Sunni thought washing through his mind like clear water. Paul would go on marching out there, he knew, and Atreides would not give himself up completely to destiny, not even in the full awareness of the inevitable. A touch of prescience came over Idaho then, and he saw that people of the future would speak of Paul in terms of seas. Despite a life soaked in dust, water would follow him. His flesh foundered, they would say, but he swam on. Behind Idaho, a man cleared his throat. Idaho turned to discern the figure of Stilgar standing on the bridge over the Kanat. He will not be found, Stilgar said, yet all men will find him. The desert takes him, and deifies him, Idaho said, yet he was an interloper here. He brought an alien chemistry to this planet. Water, the desert imposes its own rhythms, Stilgar said. We welcomed him, called him our Mahdi, our Muad'Dib, and gave him his secret name, Base of the Pillar, Usul. Still, he was not born a Fremen. And that does not change the fact that we claimed him. They've claimed him finally. Stilgar put a hand on Idaho's shoulder. All men are interlopers, old friend. You're a deep one, aren't you, still? Deep enough. I can see how we cluttered the universe of our migrations. Muad'Dib gave us something uncluttered. Men will remember his jihad for that, at least. He won't give up to the desert, Idaho said. He's blind, but he won't give up. He's a man of honor and principle. He was Atreides trained, and his water will be poured on the sand, Stilgar said. Come. He pulled gently at Idaho's arm. Alia is back and is asking for you. She was with you at Siege Macabre? Yes. She helped whip those soft knives into line. They take her orders now, as I do. What orders? She commanded the execution of the traitors. Oh. Idaho suppressed a feeling of vertigo as he looked up at the promontory. Which traitors? The guildsman, the Reverend Mother Mahaim, Korba, a few others. You slew a Reverend Mother? I did. Muad'Dib left word that it would not be done. He shrugged, but I disobeyed him, as Alia knew I would. Idaho stared again into the desert, feeling himself become one person capable of seeing the pattern of what Paul had created. Judgment strategy, the Atreides called it in their training manuals. People are subordinate to government, but the ruled influence the rulers. Did the ruled have any concept, he wondered, of what they had helped create here? Alia, Stilgar said, clearing his throat. He sounded embarrassed. She needs the comfort of your presence. And she is the government, Idaho murmured. A regency, no more. Fortune passes everywhere, as her father often said, Idaho muttered. We make our bargain for the future, Stilgar said. Will you come now? We need you back there. Again he sounded embarrassed. She is distraught. She cries out against her brother one moment, mourns him the next. Presently, Idaho promised. He heard Stilgar leave. He stood facing into the rising wind, letting the grains of sand rattle against the still suit. Mentat awareness projected the outflowing patterns into the future. The possibilities dazzled him. Paul had set in motion a whirling vortex, and nothing could stand in its path. The B'nai Tleilax in the guild had overplayed their hands and had lost, were discredited. The Kezarate was shaken by the treason of Korba and others high within it, and Paul's final voluntary act, his ultimate acceptance of their customs, had ensured the loyalty of the Fremen to him and to his house. He was one of them forever now. Paul is gone. Alia's voice was choked. She had come up almost silently to where Idaho stood, and was now beside him. He was a fool, Duncan. Don't say that, he snapped. The whole universe will say it before I'm through, she said. Why, for the love of heaven? For the love of my brother, not of heaven. Sensuni insight dilated his awareness. He could sense that there was no vision in her. Had been none since Chani's death. You practice an odd love, he said. Love? Duncan. He had but to step off the track. What mattered that the rest of the universe would have come shattering down behind him? He'd have been safe, and Chani with him. Then, why didn't he? For the love of heaven, she whispered. Then, more loudly, she said, Paul's entire life was a struggle to escape his jihad and his deification. At least, he's free of it. He chose this. Ah, yes, the oracle. Idaho shook his head in wonder. Even Chani's death. His moon fell. He was a fool, wasn't he, Duncan? Idaho's throat tightened with suppressed grief. Such a fool, Alia gasped, her control breaking. He'll live forever while we must die. Alia, don't. It's just grief, she said, voice low. Just grief. Do you know what I must do for him? I must save the life of the Princess Irulan. That one. You should hear her grief. Wailing, giving moisture to the dead. She swears she loved him and knew it not. She reviles her sisterhood, says she'll spend her life teaching Paul's children. You trust her? She reeks of trustworthiness. Ah, Idaho murmured. The final pattern unreeled before his awareness like a design on fabric. The defection of the Princess Irulan was the last step. It left the Bene Gesserit with no remaining levers against the Atreides heirs. Alia began to sob, leaned against him, face pressed into his chest. Oh, Duncan, Duncan, he's gone. Idaho put his lips against her hair. Please, he whispered. He felt her grief mingling with his like two streams entering the same pool. I need you, Duncan, she sobbed. Love me. I do, he whispered. She lifted her head, peered at the moon-frosted outline of his face. I know, Duncan. Love knows love. Her words sent a shudder through him, a feeling of estrangement from his old self. He had come out here looking for one thing and had found another. It was as though he'd lurched into a room full of familiar people, only to realize too late that he knew none of them. She pushed away from him, took his hand. Will you come with me, Duncan? Wherever you lead, he said. She led him back across the Kanat into the darkness at the base of the massif and its place of safety. Epilogue. No bitter stench of funeral still for Muad'Dib, no knell nor solemn rite to free the mind from avaricious shadows. He is the fool saint, the golden stranger living forever on the edge of reason. Let your guard fall and he is there. His crimson peace and sovereign pallor strike into our universe on prophetic webs, to the verge of a quiet glance. There, out of bristling star jungles, mysterious, lethal, an oracle without eyes, catspaw of prophecy whose voice never dies. Shai Halud, he awaits thee upon a strand, where couples walk and fix, eye to eye, the delicious ennui of love. He strides through the long cavern of time, scattering the full self of his dream. The goal is him.